Hey guys, tonight we're heading somewhere you absolutely don't want to go, unless your idea of a good time includes cold stone walls, perpetual surveillance, and fasting so often it basically becomes your new personality. Welcome to life as a nun in the Middle Ages. It's quiet, it's holy, and it's absolutely terrible. Let's be clear right away, you probably won't survive this. And not just because of the rats or the plague or the very real chance of dying from a tooth infection. It's also because mentally, emotionally, spiritually, this life demands everything. You'll give up your family, your freedom, your food preferences, and even your name. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I mean it. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. Are we winding down together? Or are you deep into a doom scroll spiral at 3 AM? Either way, I'm glad you're here. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. So, you're a girl somewhere between 10 and 14, not a woman yet, not a child anymore. Your family isn't poor exactly, but they're not rich enough to marry off every daughter with a nice fat dowry. Maybe your dad's a merchant or a lower nobleman trying to gain some spiritual clout. Maybe your mum just couldn't handle another mouth to feed. Either way, you're being bundled off to the local convent. You don't get a vote. No one comes to you and says, "Hey, would you like to spend the rest of your life praying, scrubbing, and sleeping on straw in a stone box?" They just tell you to pack your things. Actually, scratch that. You don't pack, you don't have things. A homespun wool dress, maybe a wooden comb if you're lucky, and a book if your family is wildly progressive and weirdly literate. That's it. The nuns will give you a habit when you get there. Your childhood name? Gone. You'll get a saint's name instead. Probably one chosen by your superior. You're no longer Marjorie of Norwich, you're Sister Scholastica, and that's who you'll be until the day you die. When you arrive, the convent is both smaller and more oppressive than you expected. It's not Hogwarts with stained glass windows and candle-lit magic. It's cold. It smells like mildew and cooked cabbage. The walls are thick and the doors heavy, literal barriers to the outside world. The nuns don't exactly greet you with warm smiles either. They're busy. They have routines. You're just one more pair of hands. Maybe one smiles softly at you, pats your head and says, "Obedience is love." You don't know what that means yet. You will. Now comes your period as a novice. That means you don't get the full nun package right away. You're on probation. You'll spend the next year or so being evaluated. They'll watch how you behave, how quickly you memorize prayers, how often you fidget during the psalms, how you deal with physical discomfort, and whether you submit to authority without hesitation. You know, all the signs of a spiritually solid preteen. You'll wake up in the dark, often before dawn, with a sharp clang of the bell. You'll eat bland, mushy food in silence. You'll learn the routine. Lauds at sunrise, terce mid-morning, sext at noon, and so on until at night. Your life is now scheduled down to the half hour, and in between prayer sessions you'll be cleaning, gardening, spinning wool, or copying texts if you're literate. Most girls aren't. Oh, and let's talk about the walls. Those towering, thick stone walls. They don't just keep strangers out, they keep you in. Some convents are cloistered, meaning once you enter, you can't leave. Like ever. Not to visit your family, not to go to a festival, not even to walk outside the gates. The outside world might as well be on the moon. You'll live, age, and die inside those same four walls. If you're lucky, they'll bury you under the chapel floor so you can haunt the next generation of terrified novices. And don't let the Bride of Christ thing fool you. There's no ring, no ceremony with doves and cake. Your vows come with a chilling mix of formality and finality. At your profession ceremony, you'll lie face down on the stone floor while the community sings over you. It's symbolic of dying to your old life. And yeah, it feels like dying a little. Here's the kicker though. Everyone on the outside thinks you're the lucky one. Your family will say you're blessed. Noble even. A spiritual success story. You, the pure and pious daughter, offered to God like a bouquet of daisies. They'll tell neighbours they have a nun in the family like it's an honour. Meanwhile, you're sitting through another 4-hour mass on a hard wooden bench with a numb backside and a drippy nose you can't wipe, because Sister Perpetua says movement is a distraction from prayer. Historically, entering a convent could technically be voluntary, but that's one of those historical footnotes where voluntary means strongly encouraged by your father, your parish priest, and your lack of other options. Love marriage, not an option. Want to run your own household someday? Nope. Dream of becoming a poet or painter? Sorry, art is only for copying holy texts, not expressing yourself. That's pride. And pride is a sin. And here's your first fun historical fact. Some parents sent daughters to convents before they were even 10 years old. Just parked them there like long-term storage until they were old enough to choose the religious life. Totally normal, right? And now, the fringe fact, in some medieval convents, cats were semi-sacred. No joke, since nuns stored grain and copied books. They needed cats to keep the mice population down. So there's a small silver lining: you might get a fuzzy companion. But don't get too attached. Emotional bonds with animals? Also frowned upon. God is jealous like that. Finally, here's where the scholars get spicy. Historians still argue about just how oppressive convent life was. Some argue that it offered medieval women rare education, autonomy, even leadership roles. Others say, let's not romanticize spiritual imprisonment. The truth, probably somewhere bleakly in between. Anyway, you're in now. The door's shut. The outside world? A fading dream. All you have is prayer, routine, and whatever warmth you can scrounge from a bowl of watery porridge and a midnight psalm. You never really had a choice, and deep down, you know it. That's one of the worst parts. It's not like you woke up one morning and thought, you know what would be fun? Renouncing the world forever and memorizing every psalm known to man. No, this life wasn't chosen, it was assigned like bad seating at a family wedding. And now you're stuck between Sister Agatha's ever-watchful glare and the icy draft that creeps through the chapel windows no matter the season. When people talk about nuns in the Middle Ages, they throw around words like calling and vocation, as if you were guided here by a divine voice whispering sweet promises in your ear. But here's the truth that doesn't make it into the hagiographies. Most girls sent to convents did not experience some spiritual awakening in the cabbage garden. They weren't moved by a celestial vision of the Virgin Mary or overcome by holy fervour after hearing a bishop speak. They were simply surplus. Too many daughters, not enough dowries. Or maybe your father made a politically advantageous donation to the church and needed to toss in a daughter as part of the package. You weren't invited, you were offered. And this isn't just family pressure, the church encourages it. Theologians of the time wax poetic about how virginal women are the spiritual elite. Better than married women, better than mothers, better than anyone who's ever seen a man shirtless, basically. So by sending you into religious life, your parents are supposedly giving you a ticket to heaven's VIP section, except they're also offloading responsibility, saving money, and getting social points. It's like a holy Ponzi scheme, and you're the investment. Here's a grim historical tidbit. Noble families in medieval Europe sometimes pledged daughters to a convent at birth. Like, hi, welcome to the world, baby girl. We'll be delivering you to the nuns by age 7. Hope you like bells and eternal fasting. Some infants were even dedicated in utero before they'd drawn their first breath. Technically legal, deeply unsettling, but maybe, just maybe, you had your own tiny sliver of a dream. Maybe you liked stories about saints, maybe you thought being a nun would mean peace and meaning. The idea of a simple life, closer to God, away from the chaos of peasant life or court politics, it doesn't sound so bad, right? But then you arrive and realise it's not really about holiness, it's about obedience. It's about hierarchy. It's about learning to smile while being erased. You're expected to hand over not just your body and your voice, but your mind. Think too much, ask questions or express doubts, and you'll get a stern talking to at best. At worst, penance. Because here, doubt is disobedience and disobedience is sin. And don't assume this place is some refuge from patriarchy either. Even though it's all women inside, the strings are still pulled by male bishops and abbots. If the bishop says jump, the abbess asks how high. Even inside the cloister, the church's rigid power structure snakes its way into every wooden bench and every echoing hallway. You're under God, under the abbess, and under Father Gerhardt, who shows up once a week to hear confessions and eat better food than you've ever seen in your life. There's also the small issue of control. The convent needs to know everything about you, what you're thinking, what you're feeling, whether your thoughts are pure. And here's where it gets seriously awkward, especially for a teenager. You know how growing up comes with all kinds of confusing feelings and weird dreams? Yeah, those aren't just awkward here. They're considered deeply sinful. Having an impure thought about someone from your past, straight to confession. Feelings you can't explain about another novice? Penance? Dreamt about kissing someone? That's Satan testing you. Confess now or suffer later. And if you think you can just keep those thoughts private, think again. Your soul is public property here. Confession isn't just encouraged, it's scheduled. Weekly, sometimes daily during Lent. You're constantly digging through your mind for signs of rebellion, pride, or lust. Even involuntary dreams get treated like conscious sin. The line between thought and deed? Gone. The battle is inside your head now. Quirky little side note. There are documented cases of nun confession guides from the period that included questions like, have you imagined kissing your confessor? Or, have you danced in your cell? Because even moving your body joyfully can be a red flag. There's no privacy in the soul economy. And here's the part that really bites. Even if you do everything right, pray without complaint, fast until your ribs poke through your habit, submit completely, you still might never feel called. That spiritual fulfillment they promise, that holy peace, it doesn't always come, and no one talks about that. You're surrounded by women who've given everything to God, and some of them still lie awake at night staring into the dark, wondering if they made a mistake, or if they ever really had a say. Meanwhile, life outside the walls marches on without you. Your siblings marry, your cousins have children, you hear snippets from visiting priests or letters that the abbess reads aloud, edited, of course. Sometimes you get glimpses of festivals through the gates. Laughter, music, the messy, chaotic, sinful life you were supposed to renounce. And it stings because it's not that you want luxury or sin, you just want choice. Here's an ongoing scholarly debate for your inner night owl. Some historians argue that nuns had more agency than we give them credit for, that within the constraints of the convent, some women found purpose, formed deep friendships, even ran the place when the abbess was powerful enough. Others push back, pointing out that the entire system was built on coercion, shame, and enforced submission. So was it empowerment or just nicely decorated captivity? Jury's still out. Either way, you're here now, a novice in itchy wool, your old life behind you, your future sealed in vows you haven't even taken yet, and every time you close your eyes, you hear the echo of the bell calling you to the next obligation. Prayer, silence, obedience, repeat. The vow that really seals the deal, the one that ties the whole miserable package together, is chastity, not just in practice, but in thought, in word, in every flicker of your imagination. You've probably heard the term Bride of Christ tossed around before, and it sounds poetic, maybe even noble. But here's the unvarnished truth. You're marrying a deity you can't see, can't touch, and can't argue with. And the main point of the whole setup is that you never touch anyone else ever again. No flirting, no accidental brushes of fingers, no whispered secrets in candlelight, no stolen kisses, just you, your habit, and an eternity of spiritual blue-balling. Once you take your final vows, and yes, there's a ceremony for that, and yes, you literally wear a white veil like an actual bride, the rules get even stricter. Physical intimacy of any kind absolutely forbidden. Even a lingering hug with another nun can draw suspicion. You're supposed to be above all that now. Holy, elevated, too pure for carnal desires, but your body doesn't get that memo. You're still human, still wired for connection, and yet the convent demands that you cut those wires and pretend you're not standing there shivering in your sandals every time someone brushes too close in the cloisters. And here's where it gets extra disturbing. They check. Not every convent and not every era, but in some places and times, your virginity was more than symbolic. It was a box that someone literally ticked off. There are recorded instances of nuns being examined for physical signs of chastity. Sometimes it was done before profession, sometimes after a scandal, but the fact that it was even possible tells you how much ownership the church assumed over your body. Not just your behaviour, but your biology. Now let's say you're not doing anything wrong, you're not touching anyone, you're not thinking anything impure, you're doing everything by the book, still not good enough, because you're also expected to monitor your dreams, as we mentioned, and if anything steamy crops up in your sleep, that's your fault too. Satan is always prowling, and your unconscious mind is apparently a prime hunting ground. Better get to confession, sister, and just in case you think you can escape all this scrutiny by just repressing everything until you're emotionally numb, think again. Some of the saints you're supposed to admire wrote long dramatic passages about how they wrestled their own sinful desires. One woman claimed she rolled naked in thorn bushes to drive out lustful thoughts, another tied iron chains around her thighs. These stories get read aloud during devotions, by the way. You sit there, a teenager with zero experience of the world, listening to tales of women brutalizing themselves to stay pure, and you're supposed to be inspired. Here's your historical fun fact of the night. Some convents, especially in Italy and Spain, literally locked the gates after a nun took her final vows, as in physically bricked them up, a symbolic and actual death to the outside world. You're now married to Christ, and you'll never walk the earth freely again. If that's not commitment, I don't know what is, and here's a little fringe gem. There were nun chastity belts. Not the metal medieval torture devices you're imagining, but belts or cords worn around the waist, symbolising purity. Some were actual chains, others were more like spiritual accessories, prayer cords, reminders of the vow. But in some cases, they were locked, with keys, carried by superiors. Symbolism is nice until it feels a little too literal. Let's not ignore the deeper layer of fear here either, because if your vow of chastity is broken, even if it wasn't your choice, it's not just shame you'll face, it's punishment, possibly expulsion, and definitely eternal consequences. In the eyes of the church, your soul is now in jeopardy. Did you fall in love with someone? That's sin? Did someone force themselves on you? Somehow still sin, because the purity ideal doesn't really allow for nuance or consent. You're either holy or you're fallen. There's no middle path, no understanding, no redemption arc. You start policing your own body like it's a threat. You walk differently. You avoid eye contact. You flinch when someone sits too close at dinner. And worst of all, you start mistrusting yourself. Every flicker of warmth, every flutter in your chest feels like betrayal. It's a brutal kind of gaslighting, being taught that your most human impulses are traps set by the devil. And don't think being in an all-female environment makes it easier. The church still sees you as a temptation, even to other women. Spiritual friendships, fine. But if those bonds deepen into something more, if you start confiding too much, sharing too much affection, spending too much time alone with one person, that's when the gossip starts, and the watching, and the warning talks. Let's get weird for a second with a fringe historical curiosity. The concept of spiritual marriage. Some nuns, especially mystics, would write letters and prayers describing their union with Christ in deeply romantic, even erotic language. They spoke of Christ as a lover, a bridegroom, a tender spouse. Some had visions of divine kisses or spiritual embrace. While this was praised by some as holy ecstasy, others found it suspicious. Where's the line between mysticism and suppressed desire? Still up for debate. And speaking of debate, here's the scholarly food fight of the section. Were these intense chastity requirements empowering or dehumanizing? Some argue that rejecting marriage gave women autonomy they couldn't find elsewhere. No husband, no childbirth, no risk of dying in labour. Others counter that it was just another kind of control, one that turned your body into a prison cell. Was it freedom from men, or just a life of surveillance with better Latin vocabulary? Either way, the pressure is real. You're not just forbidden from sex, you're forbidden from even wanting it. And the tools they use to enforce that go way beyond rules. They tap into your fear, your shame, and your very identity. Chastity isn't just a vow, it's a cage, one you're expected to decorate with flowers and call sacred. And so you wake up again tomorrow, tired and cold, surrounded by sandals and the scent of wet stone. You put on your habit, you tie your symbolic girdle, you lower your eyes, and you pray. Because if you don't, who knows what wickedness might try to sneak in through your thoughts. You're a bride of Christ now. There's no room left for desire, only duty. You might think a life built around prayer and devotion would have a little breathing room. A bit of calm, some introspection, maybe even quiet walks through a garden while humming hymns under your breath. But no, not in this century. Not with the rule of St. Benedict breathing down your neck like the most persistent hall monitor in history. If you thought nun life was a gentle spiritual retreat, think again. It's more like a monastic boot camp with extra guilt and less sleep. The rule is the backbone of your new reality. Written in the 6th century, St. Benedict's text outlines exactly how monks and nuns should live. When to pray, when to eat, how much to sleep, what to wear, what to say, spoiler very little, and what to think. Ideally nothing that starts with what if. And even though it was written for men originally, surprise, you still get to follow it. Because obviously, what works for a group of bearded hermits in Italy translates perfectly to the needs of teenage girls stuck in a damp stone cloister. The big three: obedience, silence, and humility. These are the core values hammered into you from day one. You're to obey instantly and without question. No thinking, no hesitating, No facial expressions that even suggest confusion. The abbess says jump, you say, how high, and may I land in prayer position? Because disobedience isn't just frowned upon, it's spiritual rot, a sign that Satan is creeping in through the cracks of your soul. Silence. Oh, you'll learn to love silence. Or at least endure it. Long hours every day with no talking, no laughing, no casual chit-chat about how cold your feet are or how Sister Ursula's singing sounds like a dying goose. You speak only when permitted, and often only in Latin. There's something uniquely humbling about not being allowed to talk or understand the language you're chanting. It's the medieval version of being ghosted by God. And humility. Ah, yes, that's the tricky one, because you're not just supposed to be obedient. You're supposed to want to be obedient. You're supposed to feel joy at your own smallness, to be grateful when you're assigned the worst chores, to feel blessed when corrected. The rule says you should welcome rebuke as a gift. So when Sister Margareta tells you your handwriting looks like chicken scratches dipped in sin, you're expected to thank her for pointing out your flaws. Growth mindset, but make it medieval trauma. The day is divided into tight, unrelenting chunks. 7, or sometimes 8, canonical hours of prayer mark the rhythm of your existence. You rise for matins in the dead of night, chant lauds at dawn, then tumble through prime, terce, sext, nun, vespers, and compline. Each hour has its own set of psalms, hymns, readings, and moments to wonder whether your knees will ever feel normal again. There's no sleeping in. No, 5 more minutes. The bell rings, you move. Fun historical fact, the rule of St. Benedict even tells you how many pints of wine a nun can have per day. Up to a hermina, basically half a pint. But only if the climate calls for it and the abbess allows it. So yes, nuns could technically drink wine. But let's be honest, you're probably not getting the good stuff. And if your convent is strict, most are, you're getting water. Maybe beer if the region brews it. Enjoy. What the rule doesn't allow. Personal ambition, individualism, anything that smacks of I think differently. So if you're the kind of person who doodles in the margins or daydreams during Vespers, the system's going to grind you down like flour under a millstone. You're part of a body now, not a mind. One hand in a larger set. If you don't match the rhythm, you're out of sync with God. There's something both mesmerizing and horrifying about it. The way every hour has a purpose, every gesture is accounted for, the way your entire life becomes a loop: prayer, work, prayer, sleep, repeat, until the idea of doing something spontaneous, like humming a tune or smiling at a joke, feels borderline criminal. Here's a strange and delightful fringe fact. In some orders, nuns developed their own silent sign language. Since they weren't allowed to talk during meals or in the hallways, they came up with gestures for common things. There were signs for book, bread, latrine, Sister Maria is stealing cheese again, and so on. It's possibly the most creative thing they were allowed to do, and even that was closely monitored. So where's the line between spiritual discipline and mental imprisonment? That's where scholars get tangled. Some argue that this rigid life gave women structure, peace, and purpose, that the rule of St. Benedict offered a sanctuary from chaos and the unpredictability of the outside world. Others say it was a form of erasure, that the system was so total, so unyielding it reduced vibrant human lives to shadows kneeling in cold chapels, mumbling Latin they barely understood. And here's the part no one likes to say out loud. For some nuns, the monotony becomes comfort. It wears down the edges of grief and longing. If you can predict your entire day down to the minute, then at least you're not vulnerable to surprise. The bell rings, you rise, you kneel, you chant, you cut vegetables, you sweep floors. It's exhausting, but it's safe. Safe in a way that crushes your spirit while also protecting it. There's no time to think about the life you might have had, not really. Not when your every minute is accounted for. Not when even your dreams feel borrowed. And so in that way, the rule wins. It strips away the you that used to be. And what's left is a person-shaped vessel of silence, obedience, and humility. St. Benedict would be proud. You, maybe less so. You're just starting to get used to the rhythm, the endless prayer cycle, the silence, the constant pressure to smile humbly through exhaustion. And then it hits you. Sleep isn't guaranteed here. Not restful sleep, not even predictable sleep. In fact, you'll be lucky to get 5 solid hours in a row before that dreadful bell rings again, jerking you from whatever scraps of dreams you've managed to stitch together. It's called the night office, and yes, It's exactly as fun as it sounds. You're curled on a straw-stuffed mattress, bundled in your habit because the convent's stone walls trap cold like they were in a competition with glaciers. The air bites your skin. Your limbs are sore. You may have just drifted off, but it doesn't matter. The bell tolls, again and again, each note crashing through the dormitory like a hammer made of noise and guilt. It's 2 a.m, and your soul apparently needs saving right now. You sit up, dizzy, your body stiff. Everyone else is stirring too, some groaning quietly, others already rising with robotic precision. You're not allowed to speak, so all the suffering happens in silence. Cold feet slide into sandals. Someone coughs. The floor is freezing. You shuffle toward the chapel like a line of half-dead ghosts, your candle flickering in the hallway's draught. And there in the dark begins matins, an hour, maybe more, of chanting psalms in Latin, while your stomach growls and your mind begs to go back to bed. This isn't once a week, it's every single night. Let that sink in, every night. You wake in the middle of your already short sleep to pray aloud in a cold chapel with 30 other people who also would rather be unconscious. There's no snooze button, no negotiating. Miss a night office without permission, and you might be assigned extra penance. Or worse, labelled lazy, or possessed. And the mattresses? Calling them mattresses is generous. You're sleeping on a sack of straw, possibly lumpy, definitely home to insects. The bedding rules, according to the rule of St. Benedict, are strict. 1 blanket, 1 mat, 1 pillow if your convent's feeling fancy, no soft stuff. Comfort leads to temptation. And we can't have anyone accidentally enjoying their lives, now can we? Here's your historical tidbit. In many medieval convents, the dormitories were unheated, even in winter. You'd sleep in your habit or wool underlayers, sometimes with gloves and a hood. In really cold climates, you might wake with frost on your blanket. That's right, frost. Indoors, sweet dreams, the schedule is merciless. After matins, you may or may not get to return to bed depending on the day or season. Sometimes Lauds, the dawn prayer, follows so closely that it's not worth it. So you might spend the darkest part of night singing about the light of Christ while barely able to keep your eyes open, then go straight into the next round of prayer before the sun even shows up. And what about daytime naps, you ask? Surely they let you make up for it later, right? Wrong! There are chores to be done, meals to prepare, gardens to tend, sick nuns to care for, and long, slow processions to walk in perfect silence. Your day is full to the brim with holy obligations and spiritual errands. A nap is out of the question. Fatigue is part of the suffering. And suffering brings you closer to God, apparently. Here's a weird but fascinating fringe fact. Some nuns develop the ability to sleep standing up or while kneeling. Their bodies just learn to do it. Micro naps during long prayers or chants. It's not sainthood, but it's definitely a superpower. If all this is sounding inhumane, well, yeah, but remember, that was the point. The discomfort was the sacrifice. The constant waking and fasting and shivering were supposed to draw you closer to divine mystery. This life wasn't meant to make you feel rested or content. It was meant to purify you, break you down, sand away your ego. Your needs are indulgences, and indulgence is sin. But here's where the real tension creeps in. Not every nun actually buys it. Some whisper carefully that they miss sleep. Some admit, just in confessional never allowed, that they feel nothing during prayers, just bone-deep exhaustion and a creeping resentment they can't quite shake. But they still get up, still march to chapel, still pretend to be alert while internally replaying a mental loop of, how is it only Tuesday? Scholars still argue over how much of this was physically necessary versus religious theatre. Was the night office about devotion, or was it about dominance? Was God truly up at 2 a.m. waiting for 30 exhausted women to chant Psalm 51 again? Or was this just the church's way of controlling the body so fully that it eventually bent the soul into shape? Some researchers suggest the intense sleep deprivation may have induced religious visions, that when your body is that tired, your mind becomes weird. You start to see things, feel things, hear voices. Whether those were symptoms of holiness or just extreme fatigue is, well, up for debate. Some of the most famous medieval mystics described their visions happening in the quiet pre-dawn hours after long nights without rest. Coincidence? So you do it again, and again, and again, for years, decades. Woken in the middle of the night to sing praises with a throat that's sore and a heart that's numb. You learn not to need dreams. You learn to stand even when your legs don't want to, and you try, really try, to believe this is making you better. Maybe it is, or maybe it's just wearing you out so much that you don't have the energy to care anymore. Either way, the bell rings. Time to go. By now you've accepted that the convent isn't interested in your comfort. If anything, the place seems designed to strip it away layer by layer, like some kind of spiritual onion, only instead of crying from holiness, you're crying because you just bit into your 4th bowl of grey vegetable slop this week. Let's talk about the food, because if you thought becoming a nun might come with simple, wholesome meals in a peaceful dining hall where everyone gives thanks and passes warm loaves of bread, you've misunderstood everything about this arrangement. You eat what you're given, you do it in silence, and you absolutely do not complain. Meals are structured, timed and silent, except for the single sister reading aloud from a saint's life or some other sobering theological text. She's not allowed to pause or improvise. You eat your soup while hearing about someone who starved themselves for 40 days and thanked God when their intestines failed. It's excellent appetite suppression. Let's take a stroll through your menu. First, there's porridge. Not the creamy, satisfying kind you might have imagined. Think. Lukewarm oat sludge that smells vaguely of damp grain and despair. Next, boiled legumes. Lentils mostly, sometimes peas. Always overcooked to the consistency of baby food and spiced only with a deep sense of obligation. And then there's the infamous dried fish, served cold, leathery, and so salty you need 3 cups of water just to survive the first bite. Meat? Forget it. The rule of St. Benedict is very clear. Monks and nuns should avoid eating the flesh of 4-legged animals. It's considered indulgent, so unless you're ill enough to get special permission, you won't see meat unless it's a holiday, or unless the cook is quietly ignoring the rules. Chicken and fish are more common, but even then, they are far from delightful. Picture a dried herring the size of your palm boiled until it's barely recognisable, then slapped onto your wooden plate with all the culinary joy of a boot print. You eat with your hands, or if you're lucky, a dull knife and a spoon carved from bone or wood. No forks yet, not unless you're Italian and it's the 15th century. And even then, forks are controversial. Too fancy, too secular, too suggestive of Satan for some reason. Truly. Meals are eaten in the refectory, a large, echoing hall with long wooden benches and stone walls that trap every cough, every clatter of a dropped spoon, every awkward stomach rumble. You sit according to hierarchy, which means if you're a novice, you're way at the end with the other lowest-ranking members of the house. You serve the elders first, then eat last, and fast if there's not enough left. It's not just dinner, it's a test of character. Oh, and let's talk about fasting, because the Church in the Middle Ages loved a fast more than it loved common sense. You fast on Fridays, you fast during Advent. You fast for 40 days during Lent. You fast before feast days, you fast because someone important died. You fast because someone important lived. Sometimes you fast just because it's Wednesday and that's what the abbess decided. Fasting doesn't mean you eat less. It means you don't eat at all, or you eat what barely qualifies as food. There's a spiritual logic to it, of course. Fasting purifies, denies the flesh, brings you closer to God. But when you're 15, cold, overworked, and your bones feel like hollow reeds from sleep deprivation, skipping 2 meals a day makes you feel less like a saint and more like you're being slowly unalived by religious bureaucracy. Now for your historical morsel. Some convents had rules stating that cheese could only be served on Sundays, and even then, only certain kinds. Other convents outlawed dairy during fasts entirely, which, if you're keeping track, means your primary protein source is now gone. Your diet, mostly grains, legumes, and piety. Bon appetit. And because this is the Middle Ages, your water isn't exactly sparkling clean either. In fact, in many places, it's safer to drink weak ale, a low-alcohol, watery beer brewed for hydration more than celebration. Yes, nun beer was a thing. Some convents brewed their own. You might have even helped, stirring the mash in massive kettles and burning your arms on the sides. But don't expect a pint of dark stout with a foamy head. It's closer to cereal water than anything you'd want to write home about. Here's your oddball fringe fact for the day. Some convents kept food relics, as in literal bits of food that saints had once touched or refused to eat. One account describes a piece of bread, mouldy and encased in wax, that was allegedly blessed by a holy woman centuries earlier and preserved like a spiritual snack pack. You won't be eating it, but you will be reminded of it, often. Now, to be fair, feast days did bring some real joy. On major church holidays, the rules relaxed. You'd get better food, maybe something spiced or sweetened with honey, maybe a bit of roast fish or an egg. If your convent had a garden, there'd be stewed vegetables with herbs. One miraculous day a year, even almond cakes might appear. And for those few minutes, you remembered what it was like to enjoy a meal. But here's the kicker. Sometimes even the feast days are tinged with guilt. Because enjoying your food too much, that's gluttony. You can't win. If you eat too slowly, you're drawing attention to yourself. If you eat too fast, you're ungrateful. If you smile because the pudding didn't taste like sadness for once, someone might pull you aside after and remind you that heaven, not honey, should be your delight. So each day you lower your eyes. You eat what you're given. You chew slowly. You keep your thoughts pure and your posture straight. And when the meal is over, you file out soundly, already bracing yourself for the next round of work, prayer, and relentless self-denial. Because even your appetite, like your soul, is something the convent intends to discipline. Let's say you try your absolute best. You wake at the bell, chant the right psalms in the right tone, never speak out of turn, and manage to swallow the dried herring without making a face. You even hold your hands exactly the way Sister Clarice showed you, with palms pressed gently and fingers skyward, and still you're going to get punished. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but eventually. Because in the convent, punishment is inevitable. It's not a matter of if, but when. And often, it has little to do with actual wrongdoing. You might not even realise you've slipped up until someone tells you. Maybe your knees were too loud when you sat down. Maybe you nodded off during the third reading of St. Euphemia's martyrdom. Maybe you blinked too quickly during Mass and looked suspiciously irreverent. Whatever it is, it doesn't really matter. Someone saw, and now you're going to pay. Punishment comes in flavours. There's the soft correction, a stern word from your superior, maybe in front of the group to maximise the sting. Sister Agnes has forgotten that humility is expressed in stillness. Ouch. That one will live rent-free in your head for weeks. If you're lucky, you'll just get the silent treatment. Nuns are terrifyingly good at that, whole days of silence. Not because of the rule, but because you disappointed them. Disappointment here is worse than open anger. It's spiritual failure. Then there's public penance. Oh yes, that's real. You stand during meals while everyone else sits. You kneel at the chapel door until someone forgives you. You wear a coarse woolen garment, rougher and scratchier than your usual one, as a reminder of your spiritual impurity. Some nuns are required to prostrate themselves during services, lying face down on the cold floor like a sinner at the gates of mercy. You might be there for an hour, you might be there until your arms go numb, but wait, it gets worse. Flagellation is a very real part of convent life, depending on your time and region. Sometimes it's self-inflicted, a whip of knotted cords across your own back or thighs, meant to imitate Christ's suffering. Other times it's administered by your superior. Not necessarily hard, just enough to make the point, literally and metaphorically. The line between spiritual purification and bodily harm, thin, shaky, and totally blurred under the banner of holy discipline. And don't assume age protects you. A 12-year-old novice can be punished just as readily as a 60-year-old choir mistress. Holiness, after all, doesn't come with a seniority bonus. Your knees hurt? Offer it up to God. You're tired? That's pride thinking your comfort matters. You're sad? Maybe your soul needs cleansing. You start to learn that suffering isn't just a side effect, it's the goal. Let's pause for a historical moment. According to some 13th century penitential guides, even accidental sins could merit punishment. Did you drop a crucifix? Did you forget a line in a prayer? Did you daydream while folding altar linens? That's spiritual negligence. Not malicious, maybe, but still punishable. One medieval abbess reportedly assigned a week of silence and bread-only meals to a nun who scratched an itch during the gospel reading. And here's your fringe fact for the evening. There were nun prisons, actual, locked rooms inside some convents, tiny stone cells where sisters were confined for serious infractions, sometimes for days, sometimes for months. No windows, no visitors, just scripture readings through the door and maybe a crust of bread if the day was going well. One 15th century record describes a nun who spent 2 years in solitary for defying her abbess. She eventually went mad, or holy. Hard to tell which, honestly. But the punishments don't always come from above. Oh no, the real sting often comes from your fellow nuns. Petty power dynamics thrive in enclosed spaces, and the convent is no exception. Sister Benedicta saw you forget to cross yourself before entering chapel. She's absolutely bringing it up during chapter, the daily community meeting where infractions are reviewed aloud and voted on. It's like spiritual courtroom drama, except you're the defendant and everyone else has memorized the entire Bible. You sit in the center while the others stand around you in a circle. One by one, they point out your faults. Some will do it gently out of duty, others will relish it. Because here's the ugly truth. Holiness doesn't erase jealousy, bitterness, or the human tendency to get smug when someone else messes up. If you've been too quiet lately, too pious, too well-liked, they're waiting for you to slip. And when you do, it's a feast. And yet, after the public humiliation, after the flagellation or the fasting or the silence, comes the part that really messes with your head. Forgiveness. The abbess says a prayer. Your sisters place a hand on your shoulder. They say you're restored. And you smile. Because what else can you do? You thank them for correcting you. You thank God for the lesson. And part of you, deep down, feels relieved. Because guilt loves structure. Shame loves routine. At least now you've paid. Here's the scholarly knot in all this. Was this system of punishment and penance a form of emotional control? Or did it actually provide spiritual clarity? Some argue that the strict discipline gave nuns a framework for growth, a way to process guilt and move forward. Others say it bred neurosis, self-loathing, and institutionalized abuse under the cover of holiness. The truth? Probably both. Like everything else here, you learn to anticipate the correction, you punish yourself before they can, you confess things you're not sure you did, just to stay ahead of it. You smile when scolded, bow when accused, and whisper prayers in the dark, begging for purity, for mercy, for rest. And then, as always, the bell rings. Time to return to your duties. You rise from your knees, adjust your habit, and rejoin the line, a little humbler, a little more afraid, but still somehow part of the fold. If you've been quietly hoping there's an escape hatch hidden somewhere in this miserable stone maze, some secret tunnel that leads back to a normal life, or even just a different one, well, I have bad news. You're not escaping. Not legally, not spiritually, and certainly not without consequences. Because once you've taken your final vows, you belong to the convent, not just in theory, not just emotionally. Legally, you are the property of the church. And should you ever get the idea to test that boundary, the world will remind you, with the chains, with shame, or with actual branding iron, that a nun who runs is still a nun, just a criminal one. Let's say you do run. It happens. It did happen. There are records of it. Women who woke up one morning and decided, nope, I'm out. Maybe they snuck out during the night office, hiding in the folds of another sister's shadow as they slipped past the chapel. Maybe they climbed a wall. Maybe a sympathetic brother or father waited at the gate with a horse. Maybe, God help them, they just walked, barefoot, hoping someone would give them a crust of bread on the road to nowhere. At first, it might feel exhilarating. The cold wind on your face, the stars overhead, the sense of movement, which you haven't felt in years. But the world doesn't welcome you back with open arms. Because here's the catch. Apostasy, or abandoning your religious vows, is a sin, or just a minor one, a mortal one. In the eyes of the church, you're no better than a heretic, or worse, a traitorous bride who's cheated on Christ himself. That's how they frame it. Not woman flees traumatic environment. No. It's bride of Christ has broken her sacred wedding vows. And the punishment. Oh, it's not subtle. Historical records show nuns who escaped being dragged back in chains, publicly, with guards, not by some metaphorical guilt train, by actual men with swords and rope. One account from 14th century France describes a group of villagers capturing a runaway nun and returning her to the convent in exchange for beer and absolution. That's the reward. Not coin, not protection, but a pint of ale and a clean conscience. And yes, branding happened. The word fugitiva, Latin for runaway, was sometimes burned onto the hand or cheek of a returned nun. That way, if she ever tried it again, people would know. She'd carry that mark into her grave, a permanent scar of disobedience. Because forgiveness, that was always conditional. Even if you're not branded, the aftermath is brutal, solitary confinement, public shaming, extra penance that can last months or even years. Your fellow nuns are told to avoid you. You're kept from participating in the choir, the Eucharist, even the community meals. You're spiritually quarantined, treated like your doubt might be contagious. And here's a fun historical detail to chill your blood. In some cases, a nun who fled could be excommunicated. That meant total spiritual isolation. No communion, no confession, not even burial in consecrated ground. It was the medieval equivalent of a cosmic death sentence. Because when your whole world revolves around salvation, being cut off from it isn't just tragic, it's terrifying. Now for your weird fringe fact, some nuns who didn't have the nerve or the opportunity to run physically found ways as to escape through forged letters. There are records of cloistered nuns writing secret letters to family, to priests, even to bishops begging for release. They wrote in hidden ciphers, used crushed berries for ink. One particularly clever nun in the 15th century baked her plea into the crust of a communion loaf, hoping it would reach the right hands. It didn't. She was caught. She spent the rest of her life in isolation. But not everyone who fled was trying to find love or freedom. Some were trying to flee abuse. That's the unspoken horror under all this. There are scattered accounts, whispers really, of nuns who fled after being mistreated by superiors, assaulted by visiting clergy, or subjected to psychological torment so extreme it pushed them into collapse. But in most cases, those stories were buried, because the system wasn't built to protect individuals, it was built to protect the church. And yet, despite all that, some nuns still ran, over and over, against the odds, against the walls, against their own fear of damnation. That stubborn flicker of rebellion, of self-preservation, it didn't always die, even in the most obedient souls. You have to admire it, even if it often ended badly. Here's where historians get tangled up in debate again. Was escape ever successful? Some say yes. A few women were granted formal release from their vows, usually through powerful male advocates or hefty bribes. Others disappeared into villages, started new lives under assumed names, but most didn't make it. The system was too tight, the shame too thick, the net too wide. You can feel the walls closing in just thinking about it. Not just the stone ones, but the invisible ones. The guilt, the fear, the relentless pressure to stay, submit, and smile through it all. Because even thinking about leaving is considered sinful. Even desiring a different life is spiritual failure. You are supposed to be content, grateful, joyful even. And yet, as you kneel in the chapel at dawn, the cold seeping through your sandals, your fingers stiff with frost and fear, you can't help but imagine it sometimes. The road beyond the convent. A warm loaf of bread bought with your own coin, a name that's yours again. A life where you choose when to sleep and what to wear and who to speak to. But imagination is dangerous here. It's the seed of rebellion. So you crush the thought. You say a prayer. You keep your eyes lowered. After all, there's no way out. Not really. By now, you've learned to hold your tongue, keep your head down and survive on barely edible fish paste and fear. You've accepted the constant scrutiny, the punishments, the sleep deprivation, and the loss of personal freedom. But just when you think you might have adjusted, might have even found a rhythm in all the misery, here comes another favourite feature of convent life, confession. Or as it's known inside these walls, the ritualised unravelling of your soul. Confession isn't casual here. It's not the modern anonymous box and whisper scenario. No screen, no dim booth. You're face to face with the priest, often one assigned specifically to the convent, who may or may not have any actual respect for the women he listens to every week. He is your gatekeeper to forgiveness. He hears your sins, assigns your penance, and, if he's in a particularly bad mood, might offer a lecture that makes your stomach knot tighter than any fasting ever could. You kneel before him, you stare at the floor, and then you begin the deeply uncomfortable process of listing your inner failures in the same tone you might use to recite a shopping list. But this isn't "I snapped at someone" or "I stole a cookie." This is "I had a thought, I felt anger, I dreamed something I didn't control." In this place your mind is never private. Your dreams are fair game. You're taught, gently at first, then relentlessly, that even thoughts are acts, that even your sleep can betray you. And here's the real kicker. You must confess regularly, weekly, if not more. It's scheduled. There's no skipping it. If you resist, if you say you have nothing to confess, that's pride. You're clearly too holy for your own good, and that's a sin in itself. It's not enough to avoid wrongdoing. You have to mine your own conscience like a coal shaft, looking for any flicker of impurity to toss on the pyre. Let's say you had a dream. Nothing graphic, just a dream about your life before the convent, laughing with a cousin, dancing in the square during a feast day. Maybe a man's hand brushed yours. No kiss, no embrace, just warmth. Just remembering. That's enough, you're supposed to report it. Thoughts of the world, attachments, desires, all dangerous, all suspect. Now imagine you have a kind confessor, an older priest who listens gently, who doesn't interrupt. That helps. But imagine the other kind, and yes, there were other kinds, harsh men who saw their role less as a shepherd of souls and more as a hammer of righteousness. There were priests who interrogated, who prodded, who fixated on particular sins with an unsettling level of interest. Some asked for details. Some suggested things you hadn't even considered until that moment, and in that flicker of shame and confusion you might nod. You might agree to something just to end the conversation, and that's how it begins, how guilt becomes something given to you, not something born from your own conscience. Here's your historical fact. In many convents, group confession wasn't just a backup plan, it was the norm. You confessed in front of your sisters, sometimes minor faults, sometimes deeper ones. It reinforced community, they said. It encouraged humility, but what it really did was strip away all privacy. If you admitted to impure thoughts or pride or envy, everyone knew, and they remembered. Fringe fact incoming. Some nuns developed what modern scholars now describe as scrupulosity, a condition where you believe everything is a sin, literally everything. You confess constantly, obsessively. You feel guilty for feeling guilty, and it was common enough that abbesses had to limit how often certain sisters confessed. Think about that. You're being told to dig for sin so deeply that eventually the hole becomes the only place you know how to live. And it doesn't stop with your sins. Oh no, you're encouraged to report others. If you see Sister Beatrix glancing too long at the gate, if you hear Sister Helena humming a secular tune under her breath, if you suspect someone's handwriting in the Psalter is too expressive, it's your duty to report it. Not out of spite, of course. Out of love. That's the line they feed you. You must protect their souls, even if it means condemning them. So now imagine the tension that grows. Every nun is both a penitent and a potential spy. Every friendship has a ceiling. Every moment of shared vulnerability comes with a question mark. Will she repeat that in confession? And worse, will the priest tell the abbess what I said? Because even though confession is supposed to be sealed, the lines get blurry, especially when discipline is at stake. And if you say something truly alarming, like that you don't feel connected to God anymore, or that you regret taking vows, or that you sometimes question whether any of this is real, that could be flagged as heresy. You could be placed under spiritual watch. You could be denied the sacraments. You could be forced into isolation for your own protection, or theirs. There's a scholarly debate that always crops up around this part of convent life. Was confession a source of empowerment or entrapment? Some argue that regular confession gave women a space to voice their fears, process emotions, and even express forbidden desires in a safe spiritual frame. Others argue it was a tool of control, coercion, and psychological conditioning. And yes, some priests used it as leverage, especially when the power imbalance was enormous. Again, the answer is both. It depended on the place, the priest, the sister, the unspoken rules. But here's the personal part. For you, as a nun in the middle of it, it's a minefield. Every confession feels like handing over a piece of your brain to be analysed and possibly weaponized. And yet, you still want it, still need it. Because when the guilt becomes unbearable, and it always does, you crave that moment of relief. You want to be told it's okay, that you're still loved, that God hasn't turned away. So you kneel, you confess, you accept your penance. And when the priest raises his hand and says the words of absolution, you feel the tightness in your chest ease, just a little. It's not joy, not peace, but it's a lull in the storm, a breath of stillness. You rise, say your prayers, and return to your duties. You're cleansed. For now. Until next week, when it starts all over again. Let's get to the gross part. The real, unvarnished, zero filters, smells you can't unsmell truth of medieval convent life. Hygiene, or more accurately, the complete lack of it. Because if you thought all that praying, fasting, and confessing would be the hardest part of nunhood, wait until you realise you're going to live in filth for the rest of your natural life. Slowly, and with great spiritual dignity, of course. First of all, bathing. It doesn't happen often. Not because people didn't know how to get clean, they did sort of, but because cleanliness was seen as suspiciously indulgent. The logic went like this. If your body feels too good, you might start thinking unholy thoughts, and we can't have that. So the prevailing belief in many convents was that dirtiness equals holiness. You mortify the flesh. you ignore its urges. And if that includes the urge to scrape the grime off your skin with soap and warm water, well, tough luck. You bathe at most a few times a year. Some convents allowed monthly baths, but many didn't. Water had to be drawn by hand, heated over a fire, carried to a wooden tub, and, let's be honest, shared. Privacy was a luxury. Warm water was a miracle. Most of the time, you cleaned yourself with a damp cloth, if at all. And deodorant, not invented yet. You mask body odour with herbal sachets tucked into your sleeves, or you just get used to smelling like boiled wool and regret. Your hair, shaved, or cut brutally short, not out of convenience, but to kill vanity. No brushing, no braiding, no admiring your reflection. You're not supposed to like the way you look. And you won't. Trust me. Now let's talk about your teeth, because they're not going to make it. You're eating acidic food with no dental care, no toothbrush, and no idea what bacteria is. Maybe you chew mint leaves. Maybe you rinse with wine once in a while. But eventually your teeth rot. They blacken. They ache. You live with it. Extraction, if it happens, is done with pliers, no anaesthesia, and probably someone holding your head still while a third person says a prayer for your survival. It's horrifying. And all done in the name of God. Here's your historical reality check. In many convents, there were communal latrines, a single stone-floored room with holes carved over a pit. No partitions, no privacy, just cold air, the smell of decay, and the sound of whatever's happening in the stall next to you. Toilet paper, forget it. You might use moss, rags, or smooth stones. And when it rains, those pits, they overflow into the courtyard, or the kitchen, if you're really unlucky. If your convent is rich, it might have a running drain system, kind of a primitive sewage channel. If it's not, the waste just sits there until someone, maybe you, is assigned to shovel it into the compost. It's humbling, it's disgusting, it's your holy duty. And let's not overlook the real terror of the Middle Ages. Lice. You're going to get them. You're probably already scratching at this point. They live in your bedding, your clothes, your hair. Well, what's left of your hair? You pick them off, crush them between your nails, and thank God for every tiny corpse. Some nuns made it a daily ritual. Others just tried to ignore the crawling. It's not a question of if, it's how many. And rats? Oh, they're around. Convents stored food, especially grain, and where there's grain there are rodents. Sometimes you see one dart across the refectory during dinner. Sometimes they nibble at your shoes during chapel. You try not to react. You try not to scream. If you're lucky, the convent keeps a few cats. But even the best mouser can't hold back a full-on rat migration. Here's your quirky historical footnote. Some nuns believed smelling bad was spiritually beneficial. Seriously. Saints were praised for the odour of sanctity, but not always because they smelled good. Some chroniclers meant it literally, claiming the stink of their suffering bodies was part of their holiness. One saint's corpse reportedly gave off the smell of roses after death, but others? Let's just say rose petals weren't involved. But hygiene wasn't just a matter of comfort, it was survival. Poor sanitation meant disease spread fast. Wounds got infected, skin rashes became sores, a stubbed toe could turn gangrenous, and when you live in close quarters with 50 other women who also haven't bathed since Lent, infections don't need an invitation. They show up, stay forever, and sometimes kill you slowly. Your immune system, constantly under siege, you're malnourished, sleep-deprived, stressed, and now you've got exposure to everything from staph to scabies. And if you get sick enough to be bedridden, you'll be tended by another nun who probably just shoveled the latrine pit and didn't wash her hands. Not because she's lazy, but because no one knows germs exist. You're at the mercy of bad air and bleeding prayers. Which leads us to menstruation. Yes, the thing everyone pretends doesn't happen. Nuns still have periods, and they're still terrible. No pads, no pain relief, just folded rags, bleeding in silence, and trying to act like everything is fine while chanting the liturgy of the hours. You wash the cloths when you can, you bleed through your habit when you can't, and you're never ever supposed to talk about it. It's considered an unfortunate but inevitable part of the female curse, best left in the shadows. There's a scholarly discussion, read academic slap fight, about whether these conditions were typical of all convents. Some argue that well-funded urban nunneries had better hygiene, heated baths, and access to medicine. Others say even the best convents were glorified prisons with chronic lice and permanent odours. Most likely both are true depending on region, wealth, and time period. But in your case, yes, you're in a modest house. rural, underfunded, cold, and deeply devoted to the belief that suffering cleanses the soul. So you scratch your scalp, grit your teeth through another infected blister, and try to pretend the ooze from the sister's elbow next to you isn't spreading. You chant louder, you pray harder, and you hope somewhere in your foggy, half-starved brain that all this unholy grime will somehow lead to divine reward. Because no matter how pure your heart may be, your body, it's a disaster. There's a certain irony in the phrase cloistered life. It makes it sound so peaceful, doesn't it? Secluded, tranquil, like a retreat you take to get away from the chaos of the world. But there's nothing peaceful about being constantly watched. In fact, the longer you stay here, the more you realise that your life is one long performance, acted out under the eyes of your sisters, your superiors, and God himself. You're never truly alone. Not in your cell, not in the chapel, not even in your own mind. The watching begins the moment you open your eyes. Every movement is a potential lesson, or a potential sin. Did you fold your blanket properly? Did you kneel quickly enough? Did you flinch during the reading about martyrdom? Sister Albina sees everything, and her gaze is like a spiritual dagger. She's not cruel, not overtly, but she notices. And in this place, being noticed is never a good thing. There's a hierarchy of watchers. The abbess sits at the top, of course, serene, unshakable, and utterly in charge. Her gaze carries weight, the kind that makes your spine straighten the second she walks into a room. But beneath her is a web of surveillance. The sub-prioress, the mistress of novices, the infirmarian, the sacristan. Each has her territory, each watches you with a different flavour of holy suspicion. Even the laundry mistress can call you out if she finds your veil folded wrong. The convent is basically a panopticon, but with more incense and fewer walls. And then there are your peers, your fellow nuns, most of whom are just as terrified as you are, but also deeply invested in not being the worst. So they keep an eye out. They note when you look too long at the gate during garden work. They wonder why you've been so quiet lately. They remember that time you sighed a little too dramatically after compline. None of this goes unnoticed. It's all material, and confession is a hungry beast that feeds on observation. Here's a charming historical detail. Some convents had a role known as the circulator. This was a nun specifically assigned to walk the halls during off hours, checking for rule violations. Was someone talking in her cell? Was someone late for prayer? Was someone, God forbid, reading something not on the approved list? The circulator didn't confront, she just watched. And later she reported. The worst part is, you start to internalize it. You start watching yourself the way they do. You monitor every word, every glance, every flicker of thought. You start rehearsing confessions in your head before you've even done anything wrong. Your soul is on lockdown, your body is a threat. Your instincts, even the good ones, are suspect. The watching becomes so constant you almost forget what it felt like to simply exist. And it's not just the sisters. There's another gaze, one you can never escape. God's, or rather the version of God you've been taught to believe in, the one who sees every sin, every misstep, every impure thought, the one who's disappointed when you feel joy in anything other than suffering. You're taught that God is love, but he's also surveillance, omnipresent, omniscient, and, let's be honest, a little passive-aggressive. Even your dreams feel compromised. You wake from a restless night and immediately scan your mind for anything you might need to confess. Did your subconscious take you somewhere forbidden? Did you enjoy it? Better write that down. Better flag it for your next confession. Because even your inner world is public property here. Privacy is not a right. It's a temptation. Fringe fact of the night. Some convents were built with grills, iron or wooden latticework separating the nuns from the outside world during Mass, or when speaking to visitors. It was meant to protect the sisters from distraction and maintain purity. But it also turned them into objects on display. Outsiders could see them, at least partially, but they couldn't fully participate in life beyond the bars. Literal architectural proof that you are being watched, but not really seen. And speaking of visitors, rare as they are, you'd think those moments would offer a breath of fresh air. But no. Any communication with the outside world happens under strict supervision. A priest, a chaperone, a double-layered screen. Letters are read aloud before they're handed over. Gifts are inspected, every conversation is monitored. Even your tone can be interpreted. Did you sound too eager when asking about your brother? Too sad when thanking your father for the dried apricots? You start measuring emotion in half teaspoons just to stay safe. And let's not forget the internal rules. You're taught to be vigilant, not just of others, but of your own motives. Are you helping Sister Matilda because you're selfless, or because you want praise? Are you praying fervently out of love, or because you want to be seen as devout? Is your humility genuine or performative? You don't know anymore. You've been here so long you've forgotten the difference between sincerity and survival. Here's the scholarly argument to chew on. Some historians suggest that the constant surveillance of convent life offered medieval women a unique kind of spiritual discipline, that it helped them achieve higher states of self-awareness and moral clarity. Others, though, argue that it amounted to psychological imprisonment, creating a feedback loop of guilt, repression, and anxiety. The truth, as always, probably sits in the mud between those 2 points. But for you, in this moment, the experience is tangible and immediate. You pick at your food knowing someone is watching. You kneel in prayer knowing someone hears your breathing. You wake in the night certain that God is watching you sleep, and not in the warm protective way, but in the you better not dream of dancing way. You are never alone, not even in the silence of your cell. Not even inside your own mind, and somehow that's just normal now. If there's a crack in the stone-grey monotony of convent life, it's in the rare, flickering moments of art. Not always the kind you'd imagine, no vivid oil paintings or vibrant sculpture, but quiet acts of creation that sneak past the rules and give you something that actually feels human. Illuminated manuscripts, delicate embroidery, chanting and harmony. It's one of the few places where your soul gets to breathe, if only for a few hushed hours a day. But, of course, there's a catch. You don't get to do any of that unless you're one of the lucky ones. First, let's be clear. Not every nun could read. Not even close. Literacy wasn't a given, not even among the so-called spiritual elite. Reading required materials, books, parchment, ink, time, and education. And education required privilege. If you came from a wealthy or noble family, chances were better. You might arrive at the convent already able to read Latin, or at least enough to chant the psalms. If you were from a peasant or merchant background, you were probably handed a psalter, and told to copy the shapes until they look like letters. So if you're literate or show promise, you might get assigned to the scriptorium. This is a room, usually dim and cold, where a few select nuns spend their days copying texts. Bibles, prayer books, saints' lives. If you're particularly skilled or artistically inclined, you might be allowed to do illumination, adding the colourful borders and gilded initials that make manuscripts so stunning. Gold leaf, lapis lazuli, crushed insects for pigment. You sit hunched over a desk, hands cramped, eyes straining. It's painstaking work, and it comes with rules, no embellishment unless approved, no personal commentary, and definitely no freestyling with the saints' beards. But still, even with all the constraints, it's better than scrubbing chamber pots. There's something sacred in the repetition, something soothing. You're making beauty, even if no one ever sees it outside these walls. And for a few hours, at least, you get to make something instead of breaking yourself down for God. Here's your historical fact. Some of the most beautiful illuminated manuscripts from the Middle Ages were made by nuns. Real women, often anonymous, whose delicate work still survives today in cathedral libraries and museum vaults. Their art included botanical diagrams, musical notation, and theological commentary, all copied with a level of discipline that would make a modern calligrapher weep. Some even signed their names, discreetly of course, like a whisper from 8 centuries ago. But most nuns didn't touch manuscripts. Most never even saw the good ones. Those stayed locked in the sacristy or abbess's chamber. The rest of you are lucky if you get to hold a tattered breviary with water stains and wormholes. Your reading is often memorised chanting, and your main job? Manual labour, garden work, laundry, cooking, spinning, weaving, the physical arts, not the mental ones. That divide between this educated elite and everyone else is sharp. You can feel it during prayers, when the Latin stumbles from your mouth while the choir mistress sails through a 5-minute passage without blinking. You feel it when the abbess hands you a bundle of mending while another sister gets to catalogue the library. It's not open discrimination, it's just how things are. Some minds were made for books, some hands were made for buckets. Here's a strange and fascinating fringe fact. Some convents allowed their most gifted nuns to compose music. Real, original chant. Hildegard of Bingen is the most famous example. A 12th century nun who wrote music, plays, and entire philosophical treatises while supposedly receiving visions from God. She's the rock star of medieval nunhood. But she's the exception, not the rule. Most sisters couldn't write a note without someone looking over their shoulder. And even if you do get to participate in the arts, you better watch yourself. Creativity that strays too far from orthodoxy is dangerous. Too much flourish in a manuscript, you're showing pride. A metaphor that hints at sensuality in a hymn, you're inviting suspicion. God may have given you a mind, but he definitely expects you to colour inside the lines. So you do what you can. You practice your lettering. You sneak a tiny flower into a page corner. You hum a tune while walking to chapel and hope no one hears the joy in your voice. Because joy is always suspect here. Beauty is meant to reflect God, not yourself, never yourself. There's also a strange sadness that comes with creating things that no one will ever see. You finish a page of illuminated text and hand it off to the abbess. It might be shelved. It might be sent to another convent. You'll never know. You don't get to sign it. You don't get credit. Your work exists in service of God and the community, not your ego. That's the official line. But deep down, some part of you wants someone, anyone, to know you made something beautiful in this silent, watching, punishing world. And for many nuns, art wasn't just about expression. It was about survival. The act of creation was a way to hold on to some small part of themselves, to focus, to feel competent, to experience something beyond the endless cycle of guilt and penance. If you couldn't escape the convent walls, at least you could escape into a pattern of vines on a margin, into the symmetry of a musical scale, into the precision of pigment carefully ground and mixed. There's a scholarly argument that convents, despite being repressive, offered rare intellectual freedom for women, that within these walls some found space to learn, think, create and lead, that for all the suffering there were tiny windows of possibility. Others counter that these opportunities were only ever granted to a small privileged few, and even then they existed under constant threat of retraction. Your freedom to write or paint or think could be taken away with one wrong word, one wrong confession. You've seen it yourself. Sister Myriel, who embroidered saints with such delicate fingers you swore the cloth breathed. One day the abbess said her designs were too worldly. She was reassigned to the kitchen. Her needlework gone, no explanation, just gone. And so, like everything else in this place, art becomes a double-edged sword. It lifts you up, briefly, gives you light, and then reminds you that you're not free, that even beauty here is borrowed, conditional. Still, you take your seat in the scriptorium, you dip your quill, and with each stroke of ink you leave a trace. Maybe someday someone will see it. Maybe they'll wonder who you were. Maybe they'll say your name out loud, just once, even if it's not the name you were born with. Let's talk about power, because even here, in a building filled entirely with women, power is not truly yours. It never was. You might live behind high convent walls, chant in a female-only choir, sleep side by side with sisters who forever renounce the world, but don't get comfortable. Men still run everything. You might not see them daily, but you'll feel their influence at every turn. Their rules shape your prayers. Their sermons tell you what to believe. Their authority looms like smoke, everywhere, even when you can't see the fire. It starts with the structure. Convents don't exist in a vacuum. They're attached to larger religious institutions, abbeys, bishoprics, even royal churches, which means your abbess, as powerful as she may seem within these walls, is outranked by any passing priest. And that's not symbolic. A priest can overrule her decisions. The local bishop can interfere in your community's internal affairs, change your leadership, or assign a confessor you don't trust. And the Pope? Don't even dream about him being on your side. He doesn't know your name, and he wouldn't care if he did. Here's a cold fact. Most convents in medieval Europe couldn't even celebrate Mass without a male priest. No matter how devout your sisters are, no matter how well you sing, you still need a man to consecrate the Eucharist. You can't bless the bread, you can't hear confession, you can't give the final rites. Your spiritual lives are dependent on men walking through the doors, doing the sacred bits, and leaving again, sometimes after eating better than you've eaten in weeks. And the men who do come, they vary. Some are kind, scholarly, respectful. Others are pompous, arrogant, greedy. Some treat the convent like a personal fiefdom. There are records, too many, honestly, of visiting clergy abusing their authority, taking liberties, flirting, worse. But who can you report them to? Other men. And we've seen how well that goes. Here's your historical proof. In many dioceses, bishops had the power to inspect convents. That sounds harmless until you remember this is the Middle Ages. An inspection could mean anything from reviewing your account books to interrogating nuns about spiritual purity, household management, and, chastity. Yeah, sometimes bishops arrived with an entourage. Sometimes they stayed for days. You served them food. You answered their questions. You endured their judgment. And then they left, usually with a gift or two, because God's representatives are apparently not above accepting pastries. And your abbess, she might be a force of nature. She might command silence with a look and organise the entire convent with military precision. But her power stops where male egos begin. If she offends the bishop, her position can be revoked. If the local priest doesn't like her tone, he might delay the sacraments. She must lead, but always defer, rule, but always obey. A tightrope stretched over a pit of holy men with fragile pride. Fringe fact time. In some rare cases, there were double monasteries, religious houses where monks and nuns lived on the same property, but separately. Theoretically equal, right? Not quite. The male abbot always had final authority, even over the female side. So even when women had their own leadership, it was often symbolic. The real decisions were made a few cloisters over, by someone who probably didn't know the names of half the sisters he controlled. And if you think it's bad inside the church, try appealing to the outside world. Civil authorities rarely step in to protect nuns, especially when church politics are involved. You're not a wife, you're not a mother, you're not even a useful woman by the medieval standards. You're tucked away, off the map. Your complaints echo inside stone walls and go nowhere. A noblewoman might have leverage, a queen might intervene, but you're just another veiled figure in a sea of obedient silhouettes. Even your education, if you had one, is filtered through male voices. The texts you read, written by men, the theology you study, interpreted by men. You may copy their words, illuminate them with flowers and gold, even memorize entire volumes, but you'll never publish your own. You'll never teach at a university. You'll never deliver a sermon. The world doesn't need to hear your voice, it only needs your silence. Let's stir in the scholarly debate. Some argue that the convent was a space of female empowerment, a rare escape from the dangers of marriage, childbirth and household servitude. And yes, there's truth in that. Some abbesses held real administrative power. Some nuns wrote poetry, music, even medical texts. But others argue this freedom was limited, granted only within tight confines, always subject to revocation. Yes, you may govern, until a man says otherwise. And it wasn't just spiritual authority. Even your material resources, the convent's land, crops, money, were often managed by male stewards or approved by male church officials. You might grow the wheat, bake the bread, and serve it, but if someone wants to sell the land it grew on, you're not in that conversation. You are holy labour, not holy leadership. The irony burns, doesn't it? You gave up everything, family, future, freedom, to serve God. And now you find out you can't even talk to him directly unless a man's in the room to consecrate your prayers. So you kneel, you sing, you serve, and you wait for the priest to show up. Late, usually, so he can do the part of the ritual that only he is allowed to perform. And then he leaves, back to the town or the bishop's estate or whatever world you no longer belong to. The walls close in again. You turn back toward the altar. Your sisters are still singing. The abbess is already organising the next reading. Life continues. And you're still here, holy and forgotten, in a world run by men who think they're the only ones who can talk to God. The first time you laugh in the convent, really laugh, it catches you off guard. Maybe someone spills a bowl of lentils in the kitchen and slips trying to clean it up, flailing like a goose in sandals. Maybe someone burps during the night psalms. Maybe it's nothing at all. Just the kind of exhausted, delirious laughter that bubbles up when your brain finally says, I cannot take another second of this silence. You let it out. Just a breathy giggle, hardly more than a twitch of joy, and instantly feel that ripple of panic. Was that a sin? The answer naturally is probably. Because here's the truth about life as a medieval nun. It's not just about prayer, poverty and obedience. It's also about guilt. Constant creeping, inescapable guilt. Not just over what you do, but over what you feel, or think, or dream, or might potentially someday accidentally imagine. There is no such thing here as emotional neutrality. Everything is weighed. Everything is measured. And joy, my friend, joy is suspicious. You're told from the beginning that the world is full of sin. That's why you're here in the first place, because marriage, music, dancing, bright colours, sweet pastries, and the feeling of sunlight on your bare skin are all potential pathways to damnation. You renounce those things. You're above them now, or at least you're supposed to be, but you still remember them. You still want them in quiet, shameful ways. Wanting is the problem. You learn that very quickly. You can do nothing wrong and still be guilty because what matters most here is your intention. Did you enjoy your meal too much? That's gluttony. Did you hum during your chores? Vanity. Did you find comfort in your own cleverness when Sister Agnes complimented your neat handwriting? Pride. There is no win condition. The game is rigged and the prize is the ability to feel bad about winning. So what do? You learn to repress everything, you flinch when you feel happy, you audit your own mind with the intensity of a tax collector. And you keep your face neutral, serene, untouchable because emotion is risky. Laughter is disruptive, sadness is selfish, even homesickness is treated like weakness. If you cry about missing your family, you're scolded, not for the tears but for clinging to worldly attachments. Here's a historically accurate kick in the teeth. Many convents had rules against excessive emotional expression. Some even banned laughter outright. It wasn't forbidden because it's bad in itself. It's forbidden because it distracts from God. Your purpose here is to mourn the sins of the world, not to giggle about Sister Gertrude's snoring. And if you can't summon grief on command, well, better fake it. Tears are more acceptable than chuckles. The worst part is, it works. Over time, your emotional range narrows. The highs and lows get trimmed off, you laugh less. You cry less, you flatten, you become the version of yourself that fits inside the convent's rulebook. And when you do feel something sharp and vivid, a spike of joy, a pang of sorrow, a flicker of anger, it scares you. Not because it's rare, but because it means you're not dead inside yet, and that feels dangerous. Want a fringe fact? Some nuns engaged in what can only be described as competitive humility. Yes, it's as unfun as it sounds. If one sister confessed to a minor fault, another might chime in with something worse, like, I once felt a flicker of pride when I swept the chapel floor and saw no dust. These confessions weren't always about honesty. They were sometimes performance, a subtle one-upping of who could loathe themselves more convincingly. You can't laugh at that. You can only feel vaguely horrified that this is your new social structure. So instead of joy, what you get is guilt disguised as piety. You feel guilty when you eat. You feel guilty when you rest. You feel guilty when you don't feel guilty enough. Guilt becomes your constant companion, your internal GPS, your roommate who won't shut up. It whispers to you during prayers. It walks beside you in the garden. It even crawls into bed with you at night, curling under your blanket and reminding you that your dreams probably contain impure symbolism. And here's the thing. Some of the guilt is personal, but a lot of it is structural. It's taught, it's enforced, it's woven into the chants, the liturgy, the rule, the stories of saints who were perfect at 12 and dead by 20. You're told to emulate women who starved themselves, whipped themselves, threw themselves into thorn bushes to avoid temptation. That's the bar, that's your role model, and hell, no pressure. There's scholarly debate about this, as usual. Some argue that guilt was a natural byproduct of spiritual striving, that nuns weren't uniquely tortured, just intensely focused. Others argue that the system itself was engineered to produce self-loathing, especially in women, whose bodies were considered inherently impure, their emotions inherently untrustworthy. And let's be real, when the spiritual ceiling is designed by people who think your womb is a vessel for sin, you're not exactly set up for a lifetime of mental wellness. You start to realise that the rules aren't just about behaviour, they're about control. If they can shape your thoughts, they've won. And guilt is the perfect tool, it's invisible. It's self-replicating. You carry it everywhere, and the worst part is, you start to believe you deserve it. That you're broken, that you'll never be holy enough, that if you feel anything too deeply, it must be coming from the devil. And yet despite all that, sometimes the joy still finds a way through. A flower blooming where no one planted it, a secret smile exchanged with another sister when the chanting hits just right, a memory of laughter from your old life, sharp and golden. You hold those moments close like contraband. You don't tell anyone. You let them glow quietly somewhere under all that linen and ash, because if you let them see, they'll remind you that holiness isn't about happiness. It's about surrender. And the only thing more suspicious than a laughing nun is one who forgets to feel guilty about it. The thing about divine protection is that it sounds great on parchment. You read the Psalms and hear all about refuge in the shadow of God's wings, shields of righteousness, angels standing guard over the faithful. Very poetic, very comforting. But then the plague shows up and the shadows you're hiding under don't feel like protection. They feel like a burial shroud. Because here's the brutal truth that really seals the deal. When illness comes knocking, it doesn't care how many prayers you've said. It doesn't care that you're cloistered. It doesn't care that you've spent the last decade in poverty, celibacy, and silence. It rolls right in through the front gate and starts sacking bodies. The first sign is almost always the cough. Dry at first, then wet, then constant. One sister misses morning prayer. Then another doesn't come to the refectory. The infirmarian says it's just a cold. People always say that in the beginning. But then come the fevers, the shaking, the swollen glands that make it look like your sisters have grown second heads overnight. And finally the smell. Not the usual scent of unwashed bodies and damp stone. Something sharper, coppery, like rot trying to crawl out through the skin. You know what it is? Everyone does. Whether it's the Black Death or one of its many cousins, typhus, dysentery, influenza, it doesn't matter. You've heard the stories. Entire convents wiped out in weeks. Whole communities buried in a mass grave with nothing but a wooden cross and a brief prayer scrawled in Latin. Once it enters your walls, there's no protocol, there's no vaccine. There's just God's will, and the hope that your name isn't next on the invisible list. And it's worse in a convent. You're packed in tight, breathing the same air, sharing the same bowls, folding the same sheets. Privacy is non-existent. Clean water is a luxury. Soap, if you even have it, is reserved for the altar cloths. You live communally, you die communally, that's the deal. Here's your historical fact. In the mid-14th century, during the height of the Black Death, it's estimated that some convents lost over 75% of their members in a single outbreak. That's not most of your friends. That's all of them, minus you and maybe a few stunned survivors sweeping out the dormitories in silence afterward. And what do you do when it hits? You can't run, you're cloistered, you can't call for help, outsiders won't come near you. The last thing any townsperson wants is to be near a plague convent. You are radioactive, unclean, and all those theological debates about the soul and suffering, those disappear fast when you're holding a bucket for a sister who's vomiting blood. There's no real medical care, just herbs, prayers, and blind hope. The infirmarian might try leeches. She might offer sage tea or press a heated brick against the spine. But mostly she just holds your hand and watches you die. You see that look in her eyes, tired, helpless, already grieving the next patient before this one has even stopped breathing. You keep praying, of course, because what else can you do? But it starts to feel hollow. You whisper the same psalms you've chanted every day for years, but now they feel like wind echoing through an empty field. You ask for mercy, but the bodies keep piling up, and at some point, whether you admit it out loud or you just feel it deep in your bones, you start to wonder if God's even listening anymore. Fringe fact to haunt your dreams. Some convents kept pestilence robes, special garments the sisters would wear when tending the sick, embroidered with prayers and symbols, as if thread and cloth might keep death away. They didn't. But the robes still hang in museums today, little patchworks of desperation disguised as faith. Eventually the grave digging begins. Sometimes you don't have time for proper burial. You line up the bodies in the cloister walk, cover them with spare habits, and wait for the priest to arrive. But the priest doesn't come. He's dead too, so the abbess says the prayers herself, voice cracking over the final blessing. You help carry Sister Teresa to the pit you've dug behind the chapel, and when you drop her in, you try not to look at her face. And maybe you survive. Some do. Some always do. But survival in the convent doesn't feel like triumph. It feels like guilt. Why her and not me? Why did God take the youngest novice and leave the bitter old sacristan? Why didn't he stop it? There's a scholarly debate, because of course there is, about how outbreaks like the plague impacted faith inside religious houses. Some claim it deepened devotion, convinced survivors that they'd been spared for holy purpose. Others argue it shattered belief, that the randomness of death, the cruelty of watching holy women suffer, stripped the illusion that prayer was protection. Either way, the theology gets slippery when the infirmary smells like a slaughterhouse. But this part isn't in the saint stories. They don't write poems about the sisters who held the basin under a dying woman's chin. They don't paint murals of the ones who washed corpses until their hands cracked and bled. There's no stained glass window for the nun who quietly slipped a flower into the habit of her dead friend before burial. This is the part of convent life that no one romanticizes, the mundane, filthy, agonizing end of holy women who died not in ecstasy, not in miracles, but in piles of soiled bedding. And the worst part? After it's over, after their last body is buried and the dormitory scrubbed raw, you still have to get up the next morning and sing matins, your voice shaking, your throat sore from crying. The bell still rings, the rule still stands, God's work apparently continues, so you file into chapel. The air still smells faintly of death, the benches are half empty, and you start the first chant, your voice thin, your heart broken, because even after death, duty remains. Even after plague, the prayers must go on. If someone starts screaming during morning prayers, you freeze, you don't think, you don't breathe, you just sit there on your bench, hands folded, mind racing through every terrifying possibility. Another plague victim, a nun finally snapping after too many fasts, or worse, far worse, possession. Because when a sister begins shaking, or is wailing or collapsing in a fit during chapel, the answer in a medieval convent is rarely medical episode. It's more often, the devil has entered the building. Exorcisms are very real here. They are not rare. They are not theatrical in the way you've seen in movies, with Latin muttered over a shaking girl and holy water dramatically sizzling on cursed skin. No, in the convent, they're worse, slower, quieter, and terrifyingly routine. This is not just a spectacle, it's a treatment. One you could be prescribed at any time, especially if you stop behaving correctly. Let's say you're the target. Maybe you've been restless lately. Maybe your confessions are getting weirder, full of intrusive thoughts you don't understand, or you've admitted to dreams that suggest something dark and unnameable. Maybe you're pale, withdrawn, irritable. Maybe your hands shake during prayers. In any other world, people might ask about your health, maybe call it exhaustion. But here, the conclusion is simpler and much, much worse. You're under demonic influence. At first, it might just be a warning. A private talk with the abbess. She encourages you to redouble your prayers, maybe assigns a special penance, fasting, extra vigils, more confession. But if your symptoms persist, or worse, if they get louder, then the whispers begin. Sisters stop sitting next to you. The infirmarian crosses herself when she hands you water. The abbess summons the priest. And the priest, of course, comes with a manual. Here's your historical fact. The Rituale Romanum, the Church's formal guide for exorcisms, wasn't fully compiled until the 17th century, but informal rites existed long before that. Medieval clerics had their own methods, laying on hands, speaking specific psalms, forcing the afflicted to swallow holy relics, yes, really, or tying them down with a blessed cord. Sometimes the possessed nun was stripped of her habit and given a scratchy sackcloth robe to wear, something to shame the demon, as if demons were fashion critics. If you're still picturing this as a one-time event, think again. Exorcisms were often ongoing. Some nuns were subjected to daily rituals over weeks or months, while their symptoms were monitored and recorded. And what counted as a symptom? Headaches, sleepwalking, crying, speaking out of turn, or simply being too emotional during devotions. Here's a fringe fact. Some convents documented these episodes in their chronicles, listing the names of afflicted sisters, along with the number of demons supposedly cast out. One poor nun in 15th century Germany was recorded as having 30 devils removed from her over the course of a year. 30. You have to wonder at what point someone paused and asked, are we absolutely sure she's not just very seul? But of course, mental illness wasn't a recognised category. Neither was trauma. And while some abbesses may have had compassion, genuine belief that they were helping, you were still the one being restrained, questioned and drenched in cold holy water. You were the one shivering on the chapel floor while someone shouted prayers over your body like spells. You were the one being watched again, constantly, this time for signs of relapse. And it wasn't just about casting demons out, it was about making you admit they were there. Because if you didn't scream or wail or convulse in just the right way, someone might think you were hiding them, which meant the rituals became performative in a way. You screamed because screaming meant you were trying to get better. You fell to your knees because collapsing meant repentance. You told them it was getting better, even if it wasn't, because anything else meant the devil was winning, and no one wanted to be the one who let that happen. The most harrowing thing, sometimes the afflicted weren't even faking. Mass possession incidents happened across Europe in the late medieval period, entire convents falling into frenzied, inexplicable behaviour. Screaming, biting, tearing at clothing, chanting in strange voices. Historians still argue about what caused it. Mass hysteria, ergot poisoning, trauma-induced breakdowns, demonic intervention. It's still debated, but it happened. Over and over. One of the most famous cases, Loudon, 17th century, yes, a bit later, but rooted in medieval traditions. A group of Ursuline nuns were said to be possessed by demons sent by a priest. The story spiraled into torture, execution, and scandal. But the pattern wasn't new. Smaller outbreaks had been happening in nunneries for centuries. It was never just about one woman's crisis. It became a communal unravelling, with exorcism as the institution's response to its own reflection. And you learn to be careful, very careful. You don't cry too loudly at night. You don't mention the nightmares. You definitely don't say anything about the voice you thought you heard during Lauds. Not because you believe it's the devil, but because you're afraid they might. The fear is always there, low and constant. Because if you crack even a little, you know how the story goes. You've seen it before. A sister who used to sit beside you, now lying on the cold floor while someone ties her wrists with consecrated rope and chants over her. And after it's all over, there's no counselling, no healing, no explanation, just silence. You return to your cell, exhausted, trembling, and you pray, not for peace, not for understanding. You pray they never come for you next. The first time you hear the rumour, you think it has to be wrong. A pregnant nun? It doesn't make sense. You're cloistered, watched, suppressed. You live in a community where even a sneeze during prayers gets side-eyed, where holding hands for too long is cause for concern and smiling during a feast day feels vaguely heretical. You're barely allowed to feel human, so how does one of you end up with the most visibly human condition of all? But it happens. It did happen. More than once, more than you'd expect. And when it does, the reaction isn't gentle concern or quiet scandal, it's the spiritual meltdown. Because a pregnant nun isn't just a problem, she's a paradox, a walking contradiction. Proof that the veil, the vows, the walls, they're not impenetrable, they're not enough. And in the world of medieval convents, where control is everything, that's unacceptable. The story spreads in whispers. Sister Clara missed her bleeding. Sister Clara fainted in the garden. Sister Clara was seen vomiting near the refectory steps. Suddenly, she's being watched. Closely, conscientiously. The infirmarian gets involved, then the abbess, then inevitably the priest. There's no privacy, no mercy, just pressure. Admit it. Confess. What did you do? Who did you let in? And here's the devastating part. Sometimes the nun has no idea how it happened. Because many of these pregnancies weren't the result of secret romance. They were the result of assault, sexual coercion, abuse, by priests, by visiting lay brothers, by male stewards who came to deliver food or repair stonework and were too friendly. But none of that seems to matter. Whether she consented or not, she is the one who gets punished. Here's your historical fact. In many documented cases, pregnant nuns were immediately expelled from the convent, publicly shamed and often handed over to civil authorities. Some were imprisoned. Some were forced to beg for re-entry. Others were married off to whoever claimed to be the father, if such a claim existed. And if no one stepped forward, if the pregnancy was the result of rape, the nun was often considered doubly impure. Not only was she a violator of her vows, but her lack of resistance was seen as suspicious. After all, how could something like that happen to a bride of Christ without her cooperation? And that's if she survived the pregnancy at all. Because childbirth in the Middle Ages was a gamble. Even outside the convent, women died routinely from infections, hemorrhaging, breech births. Inside the convent, with minimal medical knowledge and even less sympathy, it could be fatal. A hidden pregnancy discovered too late. A labour in secret. A stillborn baby buried in the cloister garden. Sometimes the baby lived, sometimes it didn't. Either way, the mother paid the price. Here's a grim fringe fact. Some convents had infant graves beneath the chapel. Quiet, unmarked, ignored. No ceremonies, no mourning. Just small, hurried burials, sometimes carried out at night. Sometimes by only one or two people who swore never to speak of it. Scholars disagree about how many of these exist, but archaeological digs have found the bones. Of course, not every case ends in tragedy. In some rare situations, a pregnant nun was moved to a different convent or retired to a rural priory where she lived out her days in silence. Maybe she was permitted to raise the child as an orphan. Maybe the child was taken away and adopted by a local family. You never find out what happens in those cases. They vanish from the record like ink wiped from a page. The community moves on. The shame lingers. And here's where the cruelty compounds. Even when the pregnancy doesn't lead to childbirth, even when a nun is accused of being too affectionate, too close to another sister, or too warm toward a visiting cleric, The suspicion alone can ruin her. She might be isolated, silenced, denied communion, treated like a danger to the rest of the house. Because purity isn't just a vow here, it's a status. Once it's gone, and no one wants to be associated with a sister who let her halo slip. There's always a scholarly debate, of course. Some historians argue that these sums were exaggerated, that they were rare, exceptional, and treated with discretion. Others point to the frequency of legal records, penance registers, and ecclesiastical court cases involving pregnant nuns and say, no, it wasn't rare. It was just hidden. It had to be. The church couldn't let the myth of sacred containment crack in public, so the women inside paid for it privately. And if you're not the one pregnant, if you're just a witness, or someone adjacent to the event, you learn something dark and permanent from the whole ordeal. You learn that even here, in this place built on devotion, justice is a matter of convenience, that vulnerability isn't protected, it's punished. That even when a nun is clearly the victim, she becomes the cautionary tale. So you walk a little more carefully, you speak less, you look away when the visiting steward arrives to unload the flour, and you make sure your sleeves cover your wrists when the priest offers his blessing. You never allow yourself to be alone with any man, ever, not even the kind ones, especially not the kind ones. Maybe, at night, you think about Sister Clara. You wonder if she's still alive. You wonder what she named the child. You wonder if she still wears her veil when she prays, or if she prays at all anymore. If you thought leaving behind the chaos of the outside world meant you were escaping drama, jealousy, and petty rivalries, oh, sweet summer nun. You've just traded one battlefield for another. And here, the weapons are sharper because they're hidden behind layers of piety. Welcome to the unspoken world of nun-on-nun conflict, where passive aggression wears a wimple, and every whispered Ave Maria might have a hidden barb tucked between the syllables. People love to imagine convents as peaceful sanctuaries where women live in harmony, joined in spiritual sisterhood and solemn reflection. And sure, sometimes they do, but lock a few dozen women in a stone box for the rest of their lives, strip away freedom, pleasure, and family, and then tell them that every negative feeling they have is a sin, you're going to get some sparks. Add a rigid hierarchy, unequal privileges, and the constant pressure to seem humble while secretly craving approval, and you've got yourself a pressure cooker in a habit. Let's start with the cliques. Oh yes, they exist. You've got your choir nuns, more educated, more respected, the ones who know how to read Latin and are trusted with singing the liturgy. They tend to cluster together. Then there are the lay sisters, often from poorer backgrounds, assigned to the harder physical labour. They get fewer privileges, less rest, and no voice in decision-making. Resentment brews, quietly, persistently. You can see it in the glances exchanged across the cloister, in the way someone forgets to pass the bread down the table. Then there are the favourites. Every abbess has them. So does the prioress. Maybe it's Sister Benedicta, whose embroidery is so beautiful that the bishop commented on it. Or Sister Juliana, who sings like an angel, and always seems to be chosen for feast day solos. They get lighter chores, extra praise, sometimes even access to the good honey. And the others? The others seethe in silence, then repent for the envy they just committed in their heads. You can't vent, not openly. You can't call someone out for being condescending or smug or passive-aggressively praying louder than necessary just to prove a point. That would be pride, that would be wrath, that would be sinful. So what do you do instead? You gossip, softly, carefully. You frame it as concern. You confess your own shortcomings in a way that just happens to highlight someone else's flaws. I worry that Sister Adelia seems so tired lately. Perhaps she's distracted in prayer. I'm ashamed to say I felt pride when the abbess praised my cleaning. I hope Sister Lucia didn't feel overlooked. And if you think you're clever, so is everyone else. The cycle repeats. You're always under scrutiny, always wondering who's watching, who's reporting, who's silently sharpening her halo to use as a blade. Here's your historical fact. Many convents held chapter of faults meetings, where sisters were expected to confess not just their own errors, but gently call out others. It was meant to foster accountability and spiritual growth. In practice, it often turned into a delicate form of religious snitching, and you could be accused without warning, without context. Sister Anna turned her face away during prayers. Sister Bertha smiled too broadly at the altar boy. There's no defence. Just acceptance and penance. Want a fringe fact? Some medieval nuns wrote poetry about internal convent politics. One 12th century sister composed a secret verse complaining that her superior was less saint than stone. Another embedded biting commentary into a hymn, swapping one word for another in such a subtle way that no one noticed, except the sister it was aimed at. It's low-key monastic shade, and it's delicious. Then there are the power struggles. If the abbess is old or indecisive, the sub-prioress starts gaining influence. Maybe the sacristan begins making more decisions than she should. Behind the scenes, small alliances form. Sisters whisper about the abbess's health, question her choices, subtly position themselves for what happens next. Because when the leader dies or steps down, someone new must rise. And though you'd never say it aloud, some of you are already imagining how that veil would look on your own head. And yet, all of this drama simmers beneath a crust of sanctity. On the surface, you're all obedient, pure, harmonious. You chant together, you share meals, you tend the same gardens, but beneath that, insecurity, resentment, quiet fury, the same human mess that exists outside these walls, just polished into something more socially acceptable. And what happens when the drama gets too big to hide? When two nuns openly clash, or someone loses her temper, there's public penance, forced apologies, sometimes reassignment. One sister suddenly moved from the kitchen to the infirmary for the good of her spirit. In rare cases, the bishop gets involved. Letters are sent, investigations begin, and while nothing may be said outright, everyone knows someone pushed too far. Here's where scholars disagree again. Some suggest that nun rivalries were just normal human behaviour, managed within a strict system, not unlike any tightly wound community. Others argue that the convent's obsession with purity and silence made emotional health impossible, creating a breeding ground for passive aggression, spiritual guilt, and internalized rage. Either way, the result is the same. Everyone's pretending to be a saint while quietly keeping score. You learn to navigate it like a pro. You know who to avoid, who to align with, who'll help you if you accidentally spill wine on the altar cloth. You confess your sins before anyone else can. You smile at the sister who tattled on you last week. And deep down you start to feel numb. Because if every thought, every feeling, every word is subject to judgment, you stop trusting your own soul. Still, once in a while something cuts through. A moment of real connection. A night in the dormitory where everyone's too tired to perform and someone tells a story from their childhood that makes you all laugh. Quietly, guiltily, but together. For a minute, it feels like a real sisterhood. For a minute, you forget you're all pretending to be perfect. And then the bell rings. Back to prayers. Back to silence. Back to being the holy woman you're expected to be. Because in the convent, even your enemies are addressed as beloved sisters. And the knives? They were made of rosaries. You were told it was a gift. That singing in the convent was a way to praise God, to lift your voice in harmony with heaven, to join the chorus of angels. It sounded beautiful. And for a while, maybe the first few months, you believed it. The music, the rising tones, the shared rhythm of voices in echoing stone. It felt like something sacred. But then the reality sets in. The endless rehearsals, the exacting standards, the silence that follows a wrong note, the looks, the subtle reprimands. The cold truth that being in the convent choir isn't about joy, it's about control. Welcome to the choir trap. Not every nun gets to sing. Choir is a privilege. With privilege comes pressure. If you've been selected for it, congratulations. You're now held to a higher standard in everything. Your posture, your voice, your spiritual purity. Any slip, any mistake is more than a musical issue. It's a sign that something's off in your soul. And the music itself? It's not like what you sang as a girl on feast days in the village. No clapping, no dancing, no joyful refrains. This is Gregorian chant, monotone, solemn, regulated down to the breath. No harmonies, no improvisation. Your job is to be precise, to blend in, to disappear into the collective sound. The goal isn't self-expression, it's spiritual submission. Each day you sing multiple times, matins before dawn, lauds with the sun, vespers in the dying light. Each canonical hour has its own chants and they must be sung flawlessly. Stumble over a word and someone will correct you later. Sing flat. You'll feel the sacristan's eyes boring into your neck. And God help you if you forget a line entirely. That kind of lapse earns you a correction in chapter in front of everyone. Historical fact. The term choir nun wasn't just about singing. It referred to a whole class of nuns who were literate, educated, and responsible for the liturgy It separated them from lay sisters, who did manual labour and were rarely taught Latin. This wasn't just musical, it was social. Being a choir nun meant you were more, and with that came expectations. Failure wasn't just personal, it was a threat to the spiritual harmony of the entire convent, and you feel it every time you open your mouth. You don't just worry about your pitch, you worry about your worth. Are you holy enough to be here? Pure enough? Does your voice reveal something you didn't mean to show? Your joy? Your fear? That flutter of pride when you hit the high note better than Sister Katerina? That too is a sin, because singing, like everything else here, is a double-edged sword. It's supposed to lift you closer to God, but it also exposes you. Your voice becomes a mirror for your soul. If you tremble, people notice. If you hesitate, people wonder. And when you're already sleep-deprived, underfed, and emotionally worn thin, standing up in the cold chapel to sing the same psalm for the 100th time starts to feel less like worship and more like survival. Want a fringe fact? In some convents, nuns were forbidden from singing if they had committed certain sins or were under penance. That meant a missed note could mean more than just bad technique. It might signal a moral failure. And everyone around you would know. You become voiceless not just physically, but spiritually. You're present, but you don't get to participate. A quiet punishment, served cold. Then there's the physical toll. You're singing in an unheated stone chapel, usually before sunrise, often on an empty stomach. Your throat burns. Your breath fogs in the air. Your knees ache from standing, sitting, kneeling, standing again. There's no choir loft. You stand on the same hard floor as always, trying not to cough during the long-held notes, trying to ignore the fact that you can't remember when you last felt warm. And let's talk about the rehearsals, because yes, there are rehearsals. These aren't short either. You'll spend entire afternoons practicing antiphons or responsories for upcoming feast days, drilling the same passage over and over while the choir mistress scowls like she's holding in a demon. You're expected to be not just competent, but angelic. And yet angels, you suspect, don't get blisters on their heels from standing too long in broken shoes. And if your voice cracks, if you miss the note you always get, if someone else outshines you during a solo and your heart flinches with envy, that's when the guilt sets in. Because you're not just a singer, you're supposed to be a vessel. Your voice isn't yours, it belongs to God. You're not meant to take pleasure in it, you're not meant to take pride in it, and yet you do, just a little. And then you go to confession and admit, Father, I felt pleased with my voice during Vespers. And he says penance, and you say prayers, and then you go right back the next morning and try not to feel anything at all. There's a scholarly divide here, as always. Some argue that choir life empowered nuns, giving them status, purpose, and identity in a system that otherwise erased individuality. Others say it was a spiritual meat grinder, demanding emotional repression in the name of sacred performance. And you're caught in the middle, because you love to sing, but you hate the way it feels now. It's supposed to be divine, but it's become another cage, one that sounds beautiful even as it traps you. And so you do what you always do. You show up. You sing. You watch the lights spill through the chapel windows. You feel the swell of voices rise around you like ocean waves. And for a moment, just a moment, it really does feel holy, like something bigger than the stone walls and the endless rules. But the moment passes. The song ends. The bell rings, and you go back to silence. When you entered the convent, you left your name behind. That was the first thing. Then your clothes, your hair, your family. But maybe the hardest thing to give up, the thing no one really prepared you for, was your property. Because as much as the convent tells you you're renouncing the world, it still wants what little of the world you came with. And once it has it, it keeps it, forever. Whether you stay a nun till your dying breath or flee in the night, the house keeps your stuff. It's not theft, it's tradition. Let's start with the dowry, the price your family paid to deposit you here in the first place. In theory, it's an offering, money or goods meant to support the convent and your own upkeep, a spiritual investment. In reality, it's a transaction. You arrive with a chest, maybe filled with linens, silver spoons, a prayer book, a bolt of good wool. All of it gets taken, catalogued, absorbed into the general supplies. You might wear your own veil for a few weeks, but eventually someone else is sleeping under your blanket. And your silver comb now sits in the abbess's chamber for special visitors. Historical fact. In some medieval orders, a nun's dowry could be quite substantial, equivalent to a year's income for a lower noble family. Poorer girls were sometimes rejected outright, or sent to less prestigious houses where the entrance fee was lower. This wasn't just a religious calling, It was an economic filter. Holiness, as it turns out, has a price tag. And if you had land or titles before you took the veil, say goodbye. Once you're professed, everything passes to the church, not to your siblings, not to your children, not if you're having any. You become legally dead in the eyes of the world. That's not poetic exaggeration, it's literal. You undergo a ceremony in which you lie face down before the altar as your fellow nuns sing prayers for the dead. It's symbolic, it's sacred, and it's a legal reset. From that moment on, you have no inheritance rights, no financial autonomy, nothing. Now, let's talk about the stuff that comes after you enter. Say you're skilled with a needle, and you embroider a gorgeous altar cloth, or you copy out an entire book of hours by hand, or you carve a tiny wooden crucifix during your off hours. Doesn't matter. It's not yours. The convent owns everything you make, even your thoughts if you write them down. And if your work is praised, if a bishop admires your craftsmanship or your hymn gets sung outside these walls, that recognition doesn't go to you, it goes to the house. You're invisible behind the walls you helped decorate. Here's a fringe fact that'll make your skin crawl. In some convents, if a nun died with personal items in her cell, like a letter, a rosary, a dried flower from the garden, the abbess had the right to confiscate them immediately, often before the body was even cold. There was no such thing as sentimental value. Objects were redistributed or destroyed to prevent worldly attachment. The idea of legacy was offensive. You weren't supposed to be remembered, just replaced. And if by some miracle you received a gift from your family after profession, say a new psalter or a pair of warm gloves, it wasn't truly yours. You had to report it. Then it went to the abbess, who decided whether you could keep it. Sometimes she'd let you. Sometimes she'd store it for later. Sometimes it just vanished. One day you have it. The next, it's in someone else's hands. And don't even think about money. You aren't allowed to handle coin. You can't earn wages, spend, barter, or own. If a visitor gives you a token of thanks, it goes to the house. If you do something extraordinary, save the convent from a fire, cure the sick with your prayers, you don't get a reward. You get extra penance for the pride it might inspire. There's a particularly cruel twist in all this. Even if you leave the convent, your things stay. Apostasy, as we've discussed, is a sin, but suppose you escape or get released under rare circumstances. You don't get your dowry back, you don't get your clothes, you don't even get the wooden bowl you carved your initials into during your first winter here. You walk away with nothing but your body and your silence. Scholars sometimes frame this total surrender of property as a form of spiritual freedom. That the vow of poverty, taken seriously, liberates the soul from greed and worldly temptation. Others call it economic entrapment, a system designed to make departure nearly impossible. You didn't just leave your life behind, you gave it away, and now you can't afford to take it back. Of course, the abbess has a different relationship to property. She controls the house's assets, manages its lands, signs contracts with local lords. Some abbesses wielded real power, acted as landlords, even lent money. But you're not the abbess, you're Sister Nobody. Your only currency is obedience. And yet, despite all this, you still find yourself cherishing little things. A smooth pebble from the garden, a dried sprig of lavender tucked into a prayer book, the wax seal from a letter your mother once sent. You know they aren't yours, technically. You know you'd have to give them up if asked, but you keep them anyway, hidden in the hem of your mattress or sewn into your sleeve, tiny contraband relics of a life that once belonged to you. Because in this place where your name is gone, your inheritance absorbed, and your legacy forbidden, those small tokens are all you have left. Proof that you were someone before the convent. Proof that you still are, even if no one else remembers. It happens suddenly, and yet not. There's no announcement, no bell, no sermon. Just a subtle shift in the air. A slower walk. A quieter sigh. Someone doesn't show up for compline. You wait. You whisper. Then you hear the word, a sister has died. And without time to grieve or gather your thoughts, you're washing her body. Because in the convent, death is a duty. And the work doesn't pause just because someone's heart stopped beating. This isn't your first death, not really. You've seen it before, during the plague, during winter, when the infirmarian whispered last prayers into a fevered ear. But this is the first time you're assigned to the washing. And when the abbess calls your name, you say yes. Of course you do. There's no no in the rule. The deceased lies in the infirmary, wrapped in rough linen, pale and still. She was old. Sister Agnes, toothless, gentle, sometimes lucid. She'd been here longer than anyone. never spoke unless spoken to, always humming under her breath. And now she's gone, her hands folded in a final pose of obedience. You feel your stomach tighten, not from fear exactly, but from the strange weight of intimacy. Death is oddly quiet, surprisingly practical. You don't cry, you just get to work. You start by removing her veil, her habit. Everything must be washed separately. Then you fill the basin with cold water, dipping a cloth and beginning the ritual cleansing. You wipe her arms, her face, feet. You speak prayers under your breath, words you barely hear anymore because they've become part of your muscle memory. The cloth is rough, the skin beneath is thinner than parchment. Every movement feels sacred and invasive at once. Historical fact, the practice of nuns washing the dead was standard in many medieval convents. There were entire manuals that described the process, how to wash, dress and prepare the body, how to position it for burial, what prayers to say. It was considered both a work of mercy and a reminder of your own mortality. Memento mori wasn't just a phrase, it was a job. After the washing comes the dressing. You put her in a clean habit, fold her hands again, and wrap her in a burial shroud. Sometimes it's reused, passed down through generations of deaths. Sometimes it's new, if the convent has enough cloth. Then you move her to the chapel and place her on a bier near the altar. There will be a vigil tonight, with candles, chanting and slow echoing psalms that somehow feel lonelier than any silence. But before all that, there's one more step, one you didn't expect. After the final prayers, after the last chant fades and her body is ready to be laid in the earth, you're given something more, a piece of her to keep, a relic. Fringe fact, in many medieval convents it was customary to preserve a part of a particularly holy sister's body, a finger bone, a locket of hair, a tooth. Sometimes these relics were placed in reliquaries. Sometimes they were just kept in a small pouch near the altar. Sister Agnes wasn't a saint by church standards, but she lived here for 50 years, and that counts for something. So they pull one of her teeth, gently, with pliers that are probably older than anyone here, and place it in a tiny wooden box. You're not sure how to feel. Horrified? Honoured? Morbidly curious? You want to believe she would have liked it. That she would laugh, gummy and wheezing, if she knew part of her was going to sit it in the sacristy next to the broken pew keys and leftover palm branches. Then comes the burial. You walk in procession, habit swishing, hands folded. The grave has already been dug behind the chapel, simple and narrow. Some convents bury in the cloister garth, some in a corner of the vegetable garden. It depends on the land, the bishop, the era. Yours is modest, a plain wooden marker. No grand inscription, just a cross, carved by someone whose hands trembled a little more than usual this morning. The dirt hits the shroud with a finality that makes your chest clench. Not because you were close to Sister Agnes, you weren't, but because you know you'll end up here too. The same cloth, the same procession, the same patch of soil, no eulogies, no mourners, just the rhythm of prayers and the scrape of shovels. Afterward, you return to your chores. The abbess thanks you softly. You help the infirmarian scrub the bedding. No feast is held, no feast is allowed. You eat your usual soup in silence, avoiding the empty seat at the far end of the table. Life goes on, it always does. That's the point of the rule. It never breaks, not for joy and not for grief. And yet something lingers, a strange stillness. You lie in your bed that night and stare into the dark, wondering who will wash you when the time comes, who will say your name during the final chant, whether your tooth will sit in the sacristy too, or whether you'll be forgotten before your grave grass even grows. Scholars sometimes debate how death shaped life in the convent. Some argue that it deepened spiritual focus, made every moment more sacred. Others suggest it enforced detachment, a necessary disconnection to keep the community functioning. You don't know which is true. You only know how cold her skin was, how carefully you wiped her eyes, how much it felt like saying goodbye to yourself. Because in the end, no matter how devout you are, how obedient, how saunt and humble, you will still end up wrapped in linen, buried beneath the same ground as every other woman who stood here before you. The same prayers, the same candle wax, the same box of bones behind the altar, holding pieces of those who once sang the same psalms with the same cracked voices. You say their names less and less, but you don't forget them. Not really. You've never felt farther from God than when you're trying to pretend he's close. That's the ugly truth no one says out loud, not even during confession. Because you're supposed to be devout, wholehearted, unwavering, eager to suffer if it brings you closer to the divine. But lately your prayers feel like talking into a well. You repeat the words, lips moving like clockwork, but they fall flat, echo back. Nothing returns. God is silent. And not in that poetic, mysterious way the abbess talks about, just absent. The worst part is, you still go through the motions. That's what's expected. Wake, kneel, chant, work, kneel again, sleep, and for cold obedience, repeat. From the outside, you look like every other sister, composed, reverent, spiritually steady. But inside you're hollow, numb. The daily liturgy turns into white noise. The psalms become meaningless syllables. You mouth Deus in adjutorium meum intende and feel exactly nothing. Sometimes you wonder what would happen if you just stopped, but you don't, because doubt is a luxury you can't afford. And if you think spiritual dryness is just a personal failing, don't worry. The system is ready to remind you how sinful it is. Let's get a historical fact in here. Medieval church doctrine recognized periods of eruditus, spiritualists, spiritual dryness, as a kind of test. Saints wrote about it. Hildegard of Bingen described times when God seemed to vanish from her senses, but saints had visions eventually. You don't. You just keep showing up, trying to figure out whether this emptiness is temporary or whether you've been abandoned entirely. The abbess warns you that spiritual darkness is the devil's temptation, that when you stop feeling God, you must double down, pray harder, fast longer, confess more deeply. But what happens when those tools stop working? When the fasts just make you lightheaded and the confessions feel rehearsed? When the incense makes your eyes water but not your soul? And here's the real kicker. You can't tell anyone. You definitely can't tell the priest. The last nun who admitted feeling disconnected during Mass was assigned extra hours in the garden, alone. Silence will restore your heart, they said. Which is code for figure it out on your own. And maybe she did, or maybe she just learned to say the right things until they left her alone. There's a name for this, of course. In modern times, people call it the dark night of the soul. But back then, it was dangerous. Because a nun who didn't feel God might as well be a nun listening to the devil. And if you let it slip that you're questioning not just the rituals, but the point of the rituals, you could find yourself under suspicion. Spiritual malaise smells an awful lot like heresy to the wrong ears. Fringe fact, some nuns responded to this absence by escalating their ascetic practices, wearing hair shirts, sleeping on stone floors, whipping themselves privately after compline. Not because they wanted to suffer, but because they hoped pain would force God to speak again, that he'd see their sacrifice and break his silence. Some claimed it worked, others were left bruised and bleeding, still unheard. You start bargaining. You whisper prayers under your breath as you sweep the cloister. If you'll just give me a sign, any sign, I'll stop complaining. You look for symbols in cracked plaster, in candle smoke, in dreams. You hold your breath before the Eucharist, hoping for a tingle, a warmth, a whisper of something holy. But all you get is bread, stale and dry, sticking to the roof of your mouth like ash. You want to believe that God is here, really. But nothing feels divine anymore. Not the music, not the relics, not even the saints whose bones rest beneath the altar. You look at the crucifix and feel really tired, not moved, not awed, just exhausted. Because if God is real, he's not answering. And if he's not real, then what have you spent your life doing? This is the part where scholars like to argue. Some say these episodes of spiritual emptiness were necessary, a kind of soul mortification that deepened faith by breaking the ego. Others say it was emotional suppression, compounded by isolation, malnutrition, and trauma. You lean toward the second option, but you also know there's no safe way to say that out loud. So instead, you fake it. You bow with just enough solemnity. You cross yourself with precision. You throw in a tear during confession for good measure. You quote Julian of Norwich and hope. No one asks if you actually believe it when she says all shall be well, because it doesn't feel well. It feels like waiting in a locked room, listening for footsteps that never come, and yet somehow you still want to believe. You miss the way prayer used to feel, back when you were a novice and every candle seemed to burn brighter just for you. You remember your first Easter here, the bells ringing at sunrise, your whole body trembling with something that felt bigger than language. You wonder where that feeling went, if you lost it, or if it left you. So you do the only thing you can, you keep going. Not because you're convinced, but because it's what you know. You whisper the hours, you kiss the crucifix, you wait for your heart to stir again, And maybe one day it will, or maybe it won't. But either way, tomorrow, you'll wake in the cold, kneel in the dark and say, "Lord, open to my lips," even, and if you're not sure he's listening. Because in this place, doubt isn't the end of belief. It's just another part of the rule. There's a strange kind of thrill in breaking the rules, even if the rule is something as small as eating a pear in the garden instead of in the refectory. The moment your teeth sink into the soft fruit, sun-warmed and overripe, it feels like a crime, and somehow like communion. Because when your entire life is dictated by bells and Latin and obedience, even the simplest act of disobedience becomes a revolution. And maybe, just maybe, you start to understand how women like you have always found small, quiet ways to take back a little control. Because here's the secret they never print in the Rule of St. Benedict. Nuns break the rules all the time, not in huge, obvious ways, not usually. There are no midnight orgies in the cloister or secret underground speakeasies behind the altar. Well, almost never. No, the rebellion here is subtle. Stealthy. It comes in the form of extra thread hidden away to embroider a forbidden design, a few minutes longer tending the herb garden, soaking in the air that tastes like freedom, a note tucked inside a psalter, a glance held a second too long across the chapel, and once you notice it, once you do it, you realise everyone else is doing it too. Let's take letters, for example. Officially, your correspondence is monitored. Every letter from family must pass through the abbess's hands. She reads it. Sometimes edits it, decides whether you're allowed to reply. But Sister Magdalene has a system. She scratches herd into the margins of parchment. Symbols that look like nothing unless you've been trained to see them. You don't know what they mean, and you never ask. But you know someone's listening on the other end. And Magdalene hasn't stopped writing in 7 years. Here's your historical fact. Even in strict convents, unofficial communication channels existed. Scholars have found personal letters between nuns and their families that were never meant to survive. Tucked into bindings, sewn into hems, written in secret ciphers. In some cases, nuns maintained relationships with siblings, cousins, or former suitors for decades. Not because they planned to escape, but because they refused to disappear. There's also the matter of contraband books. The official library is heavy on scripture, hagiographies, and theological commentaries, dense and dry. But one day, tucked behind a dusty missal, you find a story. A real story about knights and queens and riddles and strange beasts. It's handwritten, sloppily copied, and clearly passed from hand to hand. It's probably in violation of at least 3 rules, but you read it anyway, candle flickering low, heart pounding. Not because it's forbidden, but because it reminds you that imagination is still yours. And don't get started on music. Gregorian chant dominates your days, yes, but you've heard Sister Agnes hum something different while hanging laundry, an old folk tune, probably learned from her mother. She only does it when she thinks no one's listening, and the moment you cough, she shuts her mouth and crosses herself. But you heard it, and now you find yourself humming it too under your breath when no one's nearby. Fringe fact, in some convents, nuns composed original music, poetry, and even plays, often anonymously, sometimes as part of religious festivals, occasionally as personal expressions hidden behind allegory. Hildegard of Bingen is the famous one, but she wasn't alone. Across Europe, women behind walls were creating quietly, persistently, brilliantly, and often without permission. And then, of course, there are other romances, not all of them sexual, not even most, but emotional bonds that bloom in shared glances, whispered prayers, a hand brushed during work. When your world is stripped of affection, any kindness d'amour becomes charged. You've seen sisters fall into patterns, always sitting beside each other, defending each other in chapter, exchanging small gifts, a pressed flower, a prayer card, a scrap of embroidery. The church would call it particular friendship, and it's frowned upon, but it's not rare, not at all. Some of these bonds are innocent, others become more, and when they do, the consequences are brutal. Exposure means separation, penance, humiliation. One of the sisters might be reassigned. In extreme cases, both are expelled. So you learn to be careful, to look without staring, to care without claiming, to love perhaps, but never too loudly. There's a scholarly debate here, naturally. Some argue that these quiet rebellions represent proto-feminist resistance, an early expression of women asserting autonomy in a system designed to erase them. Others say they were just survival tactics, Not rebellion, but adaptation. Either way, they happened, and they mattered. Because in a world that insists you have no agency, any act of choice becomes sacred. Even something as simple as refusing to wear the wool underdress on a warm day, or pretending to sleep through the midnight bell just once, or sneaking out to the kitchen after curfew for a second piece of bread. Small things, inconsequential things, but they remind you you're still in here. Under the linen, under the silence, you're still a person. And maybe that's the real reason these acts are forbidden. Not because they threaten the rule, but because they threaten the illusion that nuns are something other than women. Complex, longing, defiant women, capable of joy, capable of rebellion, capable of choice. So yes, you eat the pear, you eat it slowly, letting the juice drip down your wrist as the sun warms your face, and for a moment you feel entirely gloriously human. And in that moment, even if it's a sin, then you don't regret it. They never tell you how loud the silence gets. Not the everyday quiet, the chapel hush, the low chant, the scrape of spoon on wooden bowl, but the kind that creeps in when you've been here long enough that even your thoughts start speaking in Latin. It's not peaceful, it's not restful, it's oppressive, like air thickened with smoke you can't see. It settles on your skin, behind your eyes, in the back of your throat. You live in a place where silence is sacred, but no one tells you what it does to your mind. At first, you resist. You whisper to yourself during chores. You sing songs from your childhood in your head. You imagine conversations you'll never have again. You think in full, messy, secular sentences, but over time the stillness wins. It smooths out your edges. Thoughts slow, words dull, emotions blur, and somewhere along the line, the silence stops being around you and starts being inside you. There's a term in the rule of St. Benedict, custodia oris, the guarding of the mouth. It's not just a call to avoid idle chatter. It's a warning. Your words are powerful, and with power comes danger. Idle speech leads to gossip. Gossip leads to division. Division leads to sin. So the safest thing is to say nothing at all. And eventually saying nothing becomes a habit you can't shake. Historical fact. Many medieval convents practiced enforced silence during large parts of the day. Talking was only allowed in designated places, like the parlour or during brief recreation. Even then, it was expected to be edifying, which means spiritual, uplifting, void of complaint. Casual conversation, not encouraged. Jokes, risky. Anything resembling honesty about how you actually feel, absolutely not. But here's the problem. Humans are built for speech, for storytelling, for connection. Without it, something inside you starts to collapse. Your memories get softer, fuzzier, like parchment left out in the rain. You forget the sound of your mother's voice. You forget the exact shape of your father's laugh. You stop dreaming in full sentences. Even your own name begins to feel like it belongs to someone else. And when you do speak, when someone asks you a question, or you're reading aloud in chapel, you find your voice has changed. Thinner, rustier, as if it's unsure it still belongs in the world. You start to speak more softly than you used to, even when no one's listening, even when you're alone. Some sisters take to silence like ducks to water. They float through the halls with serene expressions, eyes cast downward, lips moving. They seem untouched by longing, immune to the ache of unspoken thoughts. But others break. Slowly, you've seen it, a sister staring into the fire for hours, lips moving as she mouths fragments of prayers and pieces of old conversations, like trying to stitch herself back together. One girl spent weeks scratching words into her wooden bowl, not for anyone else, just for herself. Words she wasn't allowed to say aloud. Fringe fact, some nuns kept hidden journals, even though writing personal reflections wasn't permitted in many houses. These journals are rare but real, sometimes scrawled in margins, tucked behind bindings, or buried under altar cloths. They're raw and startling, confessions of fear, loneliness, anger. Not directed at the church, not even at God. Just a desperate attempt to put a voice back into a life where none is allowed. And when silence becomes unbearable, when the weight of your own unspoken thoughts threatens to crush your ribs, the convent offers only one cure: more prayer, more contemplation, more silent reflection. You're told the silence is a gift, that it clears your soul, sharpens your focus, brings you closer to the divine. Maybe for some it does, but for others it's a prison, a slow erasure, a hollowing out that looks like peace from the outside but feels like drowning from the inside. Scholars love to debate whether enforced silence was oppressive or beneficial. Some say it gave women space to think deeply, to escape the noise of a world that rarely let them speak. Others argue it was a method of spiritual sedation, a tool to break individuality, to keep women passive, compliant, and unable to organise resistance. You don't need a degree to guess which one you lean toward. Sometimes late at night, when the dormitory is dark and the world is quiet, you whisper words into your blanket, just to hear them, just to remember how. You whisper the names of your siblings, the street where you were born, the little rhymes you used to sing when your chores were done. You speak to yourself like a ghost trying to stay visible, like a candle burning low, refusing to go out. And in those moments, you realise what silence really takes from you. Not just your voice, not just your stories, but your sense that you are real, that you exist beyond the rules, beyond the veil, beyond the role of obedient daughter, bride of Christ. So you fight it quietly. You mouth songs during dish duty. You memorise poems and repeat them silently like charms. You smile when no one's